Imagine a barren hilltop in southeastern Turkey, where the wind cuts across dusty earth and scattered stones, where nothing grows but scrub brush and wild grasses that bow and straighten in the dry Anatolian breeze. The sun beats down here, unforgiving and harsh, turning the limestone rock pale gold, casting sharp shadows that move across the ground like the hands of some ancient clock. This is the borderland between modern Turkey and Syria, a place where empires have risen and fallen for millennia, where the Fertile Crescent begins its curve from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. On a September afternoon in 1994, a Kurdish shepherd named Savak was walking his flock across this very hilltop, a man whose family had herded animals across these lands for generations, when something caught his eye. Poking from the earth, partially buried and weathered by thousands of years of wind and rain, was a stone unlike the natural rock scattered around it, shaped with purpose, carved with intention, and when he bent down to examine it more closely, he realized he had just stumbled upon one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the modern era, though he had no way of knowing it at the time. This is the story of Göbekli Tepe, and we're going to spend the next 2 hours exploring its mysteries together. But let's begin at that moment, with Savak and that strange stone, because this is where everything changed, not just for archaeology, but for our entire understanding of human civilization itself. In the autumn of 1994, word of the shepherd's discovery reached the right people. An alert was sent to the regional authorities, and within weeks, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived on that hilltop to investigate. Schmidt was an experienced excavator, someone who had spent his entire career studying the early civilizations of the Near East, and when he arrived and began examining the exposed stones, he immediately recognized what he was looking at. This wasn't a random pile of rocks left by recent inhabitants. This wasn't the remnants of a medieval structure or a building from any period that the locals could remember. These were monumental stones, deliberately shaped and positioned with incredible precision, and they were old, far older than anything that should have been there according to everything archaeology knew at the time. What Schmidt found as his team began their initial excavations was extraordinary. Beneath the soil and accumulated sediment of thousands of years, they uncovered massive T-shaped pillars of stone, some of them reaching heights of 20 feet or more, some weighing as much as 15 or even 20 tons. These weren't roughly hewn blocks. They were shaped with remarkable regularity, the proportions carefully calculated, the surfaces finished with deliberate intent, and they weren't scattered haphazardly across the landscape. They were arranged in patterns, perfect circles, deliberate arrangements that suggested this was a planned structure, a building or temple complex that had been constructed with clear architectural vision and purpose. The more they excavated, the more they found. There were multiple rings of these pillars, some larger and more elaborate than others, suggesting phases of construction spanning perhaps 2,000 years. There were walls built between the pillars, made of smaller stones carefully stacked together. There were areas that appeared to be gathering spaces where large numbers of people could have assembled, and everywhere they looked, there was evidence of something that made this site unique in the archaeological record. There were carvings. The pillars weren't smooth. They were decorated with elaborate relief carvings, animals depicted with extraordinary skill and detail. There were lions, their faces carved in profile with clear eyes and defined features. There were foxes, their bodies lean and expressive. There were serpents with careful attention to their scales. There were vultures, birds of prey with their wings suggested through the careful incising of stone. There were scorpions, their tails curved and ready. There were wild boar depicted with bristling backs and powerful bodies. Some of these carvings were subtle, barely raised from the surface of the stone, requiring close examination to fully appreciate. Others were bold and dramatic, the carver having removed large amounts of stone to create deep relief images that catch the light and cast shadows, making the animals seem almost alive. When you stand in front of these pillars, and people can visit the site today, though much of it remains partially excavated and covered for preservation, the carvings draw your eye. They invite you to touch them, to trace the lines of the carver's intent, and that's when the profound strangeness of Göbekli Tepe really begins to sink in. Because here's where the dating comes in, and here's where everything that we thought we knew about human history gets challenged in the most fundamental way. When Klaus Schmidt's team took samples of the stones and the surrounding material, and when they sent them to laboratories for radiocarbon dating, The results came back with numbers that initially seemed like they must be errors. The archaeologists checked them again. The laboratories ran the tests multiple times. Everyone involved wanted to be absolutely certain, because the implications were so significant, so world-altering, that they couldn't afford to be wrong, and the dating was consistent. These pillars, these elaborate temple structures with their carvings of animals and their careful architectural planning, were built approximately 9,600 years before the present day. That translates to around 9,600 BCE in the conventional calendar system. To put that in perspective, and really you need to sit with this number for a moment to fully appreciate how staggering it is, the Great Pyramid of Giza, that most iconic symbol of human achievement and ancient civilization, wasn't built until around 2560 BCE. That's a difference of 7,000 years. 7,000 years. Stonehenge, that mysterious circle of stones on the English plains that has captivated human imagination for centuries, wasn't erected until around 3000 BCE. That still leaves Göbekli Tepe more than 6,000 years older. When we talk about the age of civilization, when we discuss the rise of cities and kingdoms and organized societies, we're usually talking about Mesopotamia and the civilizations of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, places like Uruk and Ur and the various Sumerian city-states, which emerged around 4000 BCE or so. We talk about Egypt's early dynasties beginning around 3100 BCE. We discuss the Indus Valley civilization in what's now Pakistan, which flourished around 2600 BCE, and we place these societies in a neat chronological framework where civilization begins, and then it develops, and then it spreads, and writing gets invented as a tool for keeping records, and cities become complex administrative centers, and everything unfolds in a logical progression. But Göbekli Tepe is 12,000 years old. It predates every major civilization in the world by millennia. It predates writing. It predates the invention of pottery. It predates the agricultural revolution that transformed humans from nomadic hunters into settled farmers. It predates the domestication of wheat, barley, and the animals that we associate with early civilization. And yet there it is, a complex monumental structure that required not just labour and organisation, but vision and artistic sophistication, and the ability to move and shape massive stones with only the most primitive tools. This is what makes Göbekli Tepe so profoundly unsettling to the conventional timeline of human progress. The people who built it, and we know this from the archaeological evidence at the site and in the surrounding area, were hunter-gatherers. They had no permanent settlements, they had no agriculture, they had no domesticated animals except perhaps dogs, they had no pottery, which is usually one of the first markers of settled civilization. They had no metal tools, they had no writing, they had no wheeled vehicles, no complex administrative structures, no evidence of the kind of social hierarchy that we associate with advanced civilizations. And yet, they undertook a monumental project that required the cooperative effort of potentially hundreds of people, sustained over generations. They quarried stones weighing up to 20 tons. They moved them across the landscape. They shaped them with incredible precision using only flint and bone tools. They arranged them in careful patterns. They decorated them with artistic carvings of sophisticated design. All of this points to something that deeply challenges our assumptions about the relationship between civilization and complexity, between settled life and monumental achievement. The landscape where this all happened is important to understand because it shapes the story in profound ways. Southeastern Turkey in the year 9600 BCE was not the barren semi-desert terrain that characterizes much of the region today. The climate was warmer and wetter. The Fertile Crescent, that arc of land that curves from the Persian Gulf up through the Tigris and Euphrates valleys and down through the Levant toward Egypt, was genuinely fertile. There were forests, there were grasslands, there were abundant animals to hunt: wild boar, deer, gazelle, aurochs, the massive wild ancestors of modern cattle. There were birds in profusion. The landscape teemed with life, and for the hunter-gatherers who lived there, it was a world of relative abundance. You didn't need to farm if you had this much wild game and wild plants available. You didn't need to settle permanently if you could follow the migrations of the animals you hunted. And yet, at this one special place, at this hilltop that would come to be called Göbekli Tepe, a name that in Turkish means belly hill, referring to its rounded shape, people gathered. They gathered repeatedly, over generations. They brought food and materials. They worked together on something that had no obvious practical purpose. They built something that wasn't a house, wasn't a fort, wasn't a storage facility. It was something else entirely. It was a temple. Klaus Schmidt, who would become the leading expert on Göbekli Tepe and would dedicate much of his remaining career to its study and excavation, was convinced from the beginning that this was a ritual site, a temple in the truest sense of the word. He believed that Göbekli Tepe served as a gathering place for groups of hunter-gatherers, perhaps scattered across a wide area, who came together for religious ceremonies, for the performance of sacred rituals, for the creation and maintenance of shared spiritual beliefs and practices. This idea, that humans might undertake massive collective projects not for practical survival reasons, but for religious, spiritual or symbolic purposes, turned the conventional narrative of human development on its head. We had always assumed that monumental architecture was the product of surplus agricultural production. The logic went like this. Farming allowed a community to support a large enough population that not everyone needed to be involved in food production. Some people could be released from the constant labour of hunting and gathering. These people could be drafted or recruited to undertake large building projects. This was how the pyramids got built, how temples got constructed, how cities grew. But at Göbekli Tepe, there was no agriculture. There was no stored surplus grain that could support labour that didn't directly contribute to survival. And yet the monumental project existed. Somehow these hunter-gatherers had found a reason compelling enough to justify the enormous labour investment, and that reason was apparently religious or spiritual in nature. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe has forced archaeologists to completely reconsider the trajectory of human development. Maybe religion came before agriculture. Maybe the desire to gather together in sacred community is more fundamental to human nature than the drive to maximize survival through technological innovation. Maybe the social organization required for ritual gatherings could have eventually led to the organizational structures that made agriculture and permanent settlement possible. Maybe, in other words, the spiritual needs of humanity shaped the development of civilization just as much as practical economic factors. This is a profound shift in thinking, and it's still reverberating through academia and popular understanding of human prehistory. Göbekli Tepe is still being excavated, and there are still major questions that haven't been fully answered. The site covers more than 30 acres. Only a small percentage of it has been thoroughly investigated. There are layers of sediment that contain evidence of human activity spanning thousands of years. There are areas that haven't even been touched by archaeological tools yet. Every season that new excavations take place, there are new discoveries that add another piece to this massive puzzle. When you read about Göbekli Tepe, when you see the photographs of the T-shaped pillars with their animal carvings, when you stand at the site itself and feel the heat of the Anatolian sun and see the landscape stretching out in every direction, a central mystery emerges that doesn't go away. Why? Why did these people do this? Why gather together year after year, generation after generation, to haul enormous stones and carve them with elaborate designs and arrange them in precise patterns? What need was being met? What experience were they creating for themselves? The Fertile Crescent was becoming increasingly dry over the centuries in which Göbekli Tepe was constructed. The climate was shifting toward the drier conditions that would eventually make agriculture not just possible but necessary for human survival in this region. Were these people trying to ensure good harvests? Were they performing rituals to bring rain, to keep the animals abundant, to maintain the fertility of the land? The animal carvings, the lions and boars and vultures, might have had spiritual significance. Vultures are associated with death in many cultures. Lions are associated with power and danger. Boar are fierce, dangerous animals to hunt. Were these the spiritual beings that the people worshipped? Were they trying to assert dominion over the animal world through the act of carving them? Or were they honouring the animals, celebrating them, creating a sacred space where human and animal could meet in spiritual communion? These questions lead us into the deep mystery of human spirituality and the ways that humans create meaning through ritual and community and the construction of physical spaces, and that's where we're headed next in this exploration of Göbekli Tepe. But first, let's pause here at this threshold, at the moment of initial discovery, and let the strangeness of it all settle into our minds. Here was a site that had been invisible to the modern world for 94 centuries, hidden beneath the soil of southeastern Turkey, known only to the local shepherd populations whose oral traditions had perhaps preserved some folk memory of it, though probably not. Here was a place where our most fundamental assumptions about human development had been wrong. Here was evidence that people living at the edge of survival, with the simplest technology, with no cities, no governments, no organised state structures, could nevertheless achieve something monumental, something that required planning and cooperation and shared vision. And here was a question that would drive the rest of our investigation. If these people could do this, what else are we wrong about? What other aspects of our understanding of prehistoric humans are shaped by assumptions rather than evidence? What other surprises might be buried beneath the ground, waiting for the right moment and the right person to come along and dig them up? The story of Göbekli Tepe is really the story of a fundamental rethinking of human nature and human capability. For a very long time, the Western intellectual tradition had portrayed prehistoric humans as primitive, simple, limited in their thinking and their abilities. This view had roots in several different intellectual movements and biases, some of them ancient and deeply embedded in how we think about progress and development. Progress, in this traditional view, was linear. Humans started out simple. They gradually became more complex. They invented better tools, then agriculture, then writing, then civilization. Each step built on the previous one in a logical sequence. Anything that didn't fit this pattern was an anomaly, something to be explained away or reinterpreted until it fit the narrative. But Göbekli Tepe doesn't fit the narrative. It sits there on its hilltop in Turkey, 12,000 years old, stubbornly complex, stubbornly sophisticated, stubbornly compelling proof that the narrative itself was too simple. Human beings, it turns out, have been capable of profound creativity, significant organisation, and complex spiritual thinking for much longer than we had previously allowed for. The capacity for art, for religion, for the desire to create something beautiful and meaningful. These capacities weren't invented with agriculture. They're older than farming. They might be as old as human consciousness itself. When Schmidt and his colleagues finally published their findings in peer-reviewed journals, when the radiocarbon dating was confirmed and replicated, when the world's archaeological community had to come to terms with what Göbekli Tepe meant, there was a period of genuine skepticism and pushback. Some archaeologists questioned the dating methods. Some suggested that the site might not be as old as the tests suggested. Some argued that even if the dating was correct, the significance was being overstated. But as more excavations were completed, as more evidence accumulated, as the site continued to yield new discoveries that confirmed the extraordinary nature of what had been built there, the skepticism gradually gave way to acceptance, and then to something approaching awe. Here was a site that was going to force textbooks to be rewritten, that was going to reshape conversations about human development, that was going to make people rethink their assumptions about what our ancestors were capable of. And it all started with a shepherd named Savak noticing a strangely shaped stone poking out of the earth on a barren hilltop in southeastern Turkey. The T-shaped pillars themselves are one of the most mysterious aspects of Göbekli Tepe. Why this particular shape? In some cultures throughout history, T-shaped objects have had spiritual significance. In ancient Egypt, the Ankh symbol, which resembles a T with a loop at the top, was a powerful religious symbol representing life and eternal life. In some interpretations, the pillars at Göbekli Tepe might have been intended to represent human figures, with the horizontal bar as arms and the vertical portion as the body and head. This interpretation gains some credibility when you look at some of the pillars and notice that they seem to have been intentionally carved to suggest faces or facial features. Some pillars have what might be interpreted as eyes or mouths. Some have what could be taken as hair or headdresses. If this interpretation is correct, then Göbekli Tepe contains sculptures, in addition to being an architectural structure. These would be some of the oldest known monumental sculptures in the world. The idea that these might be representations of human forms, perhaps sacred human forms, perhaps representations of ancestors or spirits or gods, this adds another layer of meaning to the site. Imagine walking through those stone circles in the darkness, in the light of torches or fires, surrounded by the carved pillars that might have seemed almost alive in the flickering light, their faces watching from the stone, their presence creating a sense of spiritual communion or contact with something beyond the ordinary human world. This would have been a place of profound power and meaning. The precision of the work is also striking. These pillars were quarried from stone using only flint and stone tools. Flint is hard but brittle. Making tools out of flint requires skill, practice, and a deep understanding of how the stone fractures and breaks. The The quarrying process would have involved using these flint tools to create shallow channels along the edges of the stone they wanted to extract, gradually weakening the connection until the stone could be broken free or levered away from the larger outcrop. Once the stone was quarried, it had to be roughly shaped, still using only stone tools, and then it had to be transported, which probably involved using sledges made of wood and animals to drag the massive stones, some weighing as much as a large automobile, to the site and then into place. And then came the carving, the detailed work of creating the animal images and the subtle features that make each pillar distinctive. This entire process, from beginning to end, would have required an enormous investment of human time and effort. Conservative estimates suggest that a single pillar, from quarrying to final carving, might have required hundreds of hours of human labour. With dozens of pillars at the site, the total labour investment over the centuries of construction would have been measured in the hundreds of thousands of hours. This is staggering. This is not something that could be undertaken casually. This would have required genuine commitment, sustained organisation, and a level of social cooperation that was previously thought impossible for hunter-gatherer societies. The implications of Göbekli Tepe are still unfolding, and will probably continue to unfold for generations as more research is conducted and as new theoretical frameworks are developed to make sense of what we're seeing. But standing at the threshold of this discovery, at the moment where a shepherd's curious eye opened a window onto a world that had been hidden for 12,000 years, we can begin to sense the profound transformation in human understanding that this site represents. We stand at a place where human creativity and spiritual longing combine to create something that endures across millennia, that speaks across the vast gulf of years to people who live in a fundamentally different world. We stand at the beginning of a story that doesn't end at the site itself, but extends backward into the prehistory of human spirituality and forward into the development of civilization itself. And we stand on the threshold of asking new questions about ourselves, about what drives human beings to create, to gather in community, to build temples to the sacred, to make art on stone that will outlast us by thousands of years. This is the story we're going to explore together, and it begins with that shepherd, that stone, and that German archaeologist who recognised the extraordinary significance of what had been found. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe to the Calm Archive and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it's fascinating to see people from all over the world listening to these stories during the quiet hours when the day is winding down and you're lying in bed, letting these words carry you towards sleep. It's a privilege to be part of that ritual for you, and I take it seriously. Anyway, back to the hilltop in Turkey, where we're going to go much deeper into the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe, into the world of the people who built it, into the question of why this place mattered so much that they kept returning to it, generation after generation, to add to it and reshape it and maintain it as a sacred centre of their world. To truly understand Göbekli Tepe, we must step back across 12,000 years and imagine ourselves standing in a world almost entirely transformed from the one we know today. The light falls differently on these ancient hills. The air moves differently. The sounds that fill the landscape are not the hum of human civilization, but the vast, rolling chorus of a world that has just begun to awaken from an age of ice. This is where our story truly begins, not at the temple itself, but in the world that birthed it. 12,000 years ago, the last ice age was dying. For more than 2 million years, great glaciers had advanced and retreated across much of the Earth, sculpting the landscape, determining where humans could live and where they could not. But around 13,000 years ago, the climate began to shift. The glaciers that had covered much of Europe and North America started their final retreat. They crept northward, year by year, century by century, opening new lands as they withdrew. The world was warming. The ice was loosening its grip. In the region that would become known as the Fertile Crescent, a crescent-shaped arc of land stretching from Egypt through the Levant and up into Mesopotamia, the warming was profound and transformative. This land, now called the Middle East, was emerging into a new season. The glaciers of the north were retreating. The climate patterns that had kept the region dry and marginal were shifting. More rain was falling. The winters were becoming less severe. The summers, though still intense, were becoming more predictable. Plant and animal life was responding to this transformation. Seeds that had lain dormant for generations began to sprout. Herds that had clustered in the few habitable zones began to spread and diversify. Life was returning to the hills. The landscape itself was lusher than what we see there today. Imagine standing on those ancient slopes and seeing something approaching a savanna or semi-arid grassland, but with more vegetation than exists now, the Fertile Crescent. 12,000 years ago was not the same parched, carefully irrigated and managed landscape we know today. It was wilder, more generous, more alive with abundance. Rainfall came more regularly. Groundwater sat closer to the surface. The springs and rivers flowed more reliably. The hills themselves seemed to pulse with potential. These hills, where Göbekli Tepe would eventually rise, were covered in forests and scrublands. Oak trees would have grown there, along with pistachio and almond. Wild grains grew in profusion in the open areas, wild wheat and wild barley, relatives of the domesticated grains that would later feed civilizations. These were not cultivated fields where humans planted and tended rows. These were wild stands of grain that grew naturally from the earth, planted by wind and water and ancient cycles. When the season came, the grain would ripen, and anyone in the region would know to harvest it. But the grain grew wild and free, asking nothing from the humans who gathered it, which meant humans did not yet need to settle down to protect their crops. In this landscape lived the human communities that would build Göbekli Tepe. They were hunter-gatherers, and this term, perhaps more than any other, shaped how archaeologists and historians understood them before Göbekli Tepe was discovered. The word hunter-gatherer carries weight and implication. In the old narrative of human progress, hunter-gatherers occupied a particular place. They were placed at the base of the ladder of civilization. They were understood to be simple, transient, unable to accumulate wealth or organize complex societies. They were thought to be constrained by their mode of subsistence, necessarily nomadic because they moved from one resource to another, following the seasons, following the herds. They lacked settled communities. They lacked permanent architecture. They lacked the surplus that comes from agriculture, surplus that the old theory claimed was necessary for art, for trade, for organized religion, for monuments. The picture was clear and convincing. Civilization required agriculture. Agriculture required settlement. Settlement allowed for surplus production. Surplus allowed for specialization. Some people became priests, others became rulers, others became craftspeople. And with this specialization and surplus came the elaborate structures of civilization, temples, fortifications, written language. Before agriculture, there could be no permanent settlements. Before permanent settlements, there could be no sophisticated society. The hunter-gatherers were understood to be caught in a kind of equilibrium with their environment, not driven by the ambitions that would later create the ancient world. And then Göbekli Tepe appeared in the archaeological record, and this entire narrative had to shift. But to understand why Göbekli Tepe was so revolutionary, we need to understand what the hunter-gatherers of the Fertile Crescent were actually like. Not myths or theories, but the evidence of their lives, what they ate, how they lived, how they organized themselves, what tools they possessed, and what dreams or visions might have driven them forward. The people of the Fertile Crescent 12,000 years ago lived in small bands. The typical group would have numbered between 20 and 50 people, a social unit small enough that everyone knew everyone else, that kinship ties were immediate and real, that reputation and behavior could be monitored and managed by the group itself. These bands were not isolated islands. They existed within a network of neighboring groups, related by blood and marriage, with whom they would trade, meet at seasonal gatherings, and communicate. Anthropologists call this the regional network, and archaeological evidence suggests these networks sometimes included dozens of bands spread across hundreds of square kilometers. Within each band, there would have been divisions of labor. The men, on average, likely spent more of their time hunting. The women, on average, likely spent more of their time gathering plant foods, seeds, nuts, fruits, roots, and collecting other resources like water, fiber, and firewood. Children would have helped both. The elderly would have provided knowledge and guidance. But these divisions were flexible, not rigid. When opportunity arose, individuals could move between roles. The work of survival was shared and necessary. The hunt was a central part of life, though perhaps not the dominant source of calories for many groups. The Fertile Crescent was home to a remarkable array of large animals. The aurochs, a massive wild cattle standing over 6 feet at the shoulder with long horns, roamed the grasslands and open areas. These animals were dangerous and powerful, and hunting them required skill, bravery, and cooperation. A successful aurochs hunt would have involved multiple hunters working together to drive the animal into a trap or to corner it in a way that allowed them to bring it down. The meat from a single aurochs would have fed a band for weeks, and the hide, bones, and organs would have provided materials for clothing, tools, and shelter. Besides the aurochs, there were gazelle, smaller, faster, often hunted in groups using drives and traps. There were wild boar, dangerous and fierce. There were onagers, wild asses, and various species of deer. The skies held birds, and the rivers held fish. The evidence from this period shows that different groups in the region specialized in hunting different animals, which suggests that choice and preference shaped their practices, not just random opportunism. Some communities hunting in areas rich with gazelle became expert at gazelle hunting. Others, where aurochs were common, developed the skills and tactics to hunt these massive creatures. The hunt was not a simple act of desperation, but a practiced art with techniques developed, refined, and passed down through generations. Gathering was equally important, and in many regions plant foods probably provided more calories than meat. The wild grains, wheat and barley, were a treasure. When ripe, they could be harvested by hand, or the grain heads could be knocked into baskets with a simple striking tool. A single woman working for a few weeks during the harvest season could gather enough grain to provide carbohydrates for herself and perhaps one or two family members for much of the year. Beyond grains, there were nuts from oak and pistachio trees, fruits and berries according to season, roots and tubers that could be dug from the earth. The landscape provided an abundance for those who knew where and when to look. The technology of these people was elegant and effective, though it seems simple to modern eyes. Their tools were made primarily from flint and other stone, worked to sharp edges through techniques refined over tens of thousands of years. They had blades and scrapers for cutting and processing meat and hides. They had grinding stones for processing plant foods. They had weights for fishing nets. They had bone and antler tools for fishing hooks and harpoons. They had fire, which they could create and maintain and use for warmth, cooking, and light. They had baskets woven from plant fibers, in which they could store and transport goods. They had clothing made from animal hides, sewn together with bone needles and thread. They had the ability to build shelters using branches and hides and stone. What they did not have was pottery. Pottery is one of those markers that archaeologists often use to denote a settled lifestyle. You make pottery when you have a place to keep it, when you're staying in one location. Without pottery, these people stored their foods in baskets, gourds, and hides. What they did not have was metal. Metalworking requires high temperatures, specialized knowledge, and settled communities. You build a smithy in a permanent place. There was no copper, no bronze, no iron in their toolkit. What they did not have was agriculture, at least not in its developed form. They did not plant seeds and tend crops and harvest fields. They did not domesticate animals beyond possibly the dog. They lived in the landscape without fundamentally transforming it to suit themselves, or so the old theory would have held. Most importantly, before Göbekli Tepe was discovered, it was thought that they did not have permanent settlements. The old narrative suggested that hunter-gatherer communities were necessarily nomadic. They followed the herds. They moved from one seasonal resource to another. They could never accumulate enough surplus to support a settled population. They left no monumental architecture. They built no temples. They had no organized priesthood. They had no public ceremonies that required complex coordination and planning. This was the world as understood before Göbekli Tepe, simple, effective within its limits, but limited nonetheless. A world where survival took up most of the time and energy. A world where cooperation rarely extended beyond immediate family or the band itself. A world where visions and dreams and religious impulses might exist, but could not be expressed in stone and labour. But let us now consider the evidence of these people's actual lives. The anthropological and archaeological record suggests something more complex and surprising. While many groups certainly were nomadic, evidence suggests that some groups moved into semi-permanent or permanent settlements, particularly in areas with especially rich resources. The Natufian culture, which emerged in the Fertile Crescent around 12,500 years ago, right around the time when people were building Göbekli Tepe, left evidence of permanent or semi-permanent villages with houses that suggest people stayed in one place for much or all of the year, before agriculture, before pottery, before any of the things that were supposed to require settlement. These early settlements were not large by later standards. A Natufian village might have contained 50 to 200 people, several extended families or bands living in close proximity. The houses were round or oval, with stone foundations and presumably walls of branches and hides or earth. They were not randomly scattered, but arranged in ways that suggest community planning. Around the settlements, people gathered wild resources in managed ways, harvesting certain plants in certain seasons, maintaining stands of grain-producing vegetation, possibly even using fire to clear land and promote the growth of desired plants. Social organisation in these settlements would have been more complex than in mobile bands. With more people living in closer proximity, there would have been more need for rules, for agreed-upon ways of handling conflict, for leaders or councils to make decisions affecting the group. The evidence suggests the emergence of what anthropologists call big men, individuals whose skill, charisma, or perceived connection to spiritual power gave them influence and authority that extended beyond their immediate family. These individuals might have organised hunting expeditions, overseen the redistribution of resources, or led religious ceremonies. They would have had more prestige, more goods, more influence than ordinary band members, but they would not have had the kind of coercive hereditary power that later political leaders would wield. Their authority existed through consent and reputation and perceived ability, and it could be withdrawn if the community lost faith. The landscape these people inhabited was not static. Even as climate warmed overall, there were variations, periods of greater and lesser rainfall, shifts in which animal species were abundant in which areas. The peoples of the region had to be adaptive, moving to new areas when resources dwindled, developing new technologies to exploit new resources when old ones became scarce. This adaptability, this capacity to learn, to innovate, to adjust, may have been as much a part of their culture as it was of their biology. The spiritual lives of these people are harder to discern from the archaeological record, but not impossible to imagine. They would have observed the celestial sphere, the sun, the moon, the planets, the stars, which move through the sky in repeating patterns. They would have noticed the connection between these celestial movements and the seasons, and the connection between the seasons and the abundance or scarcity of food. They would have experienced illness, injury, death, and the emotions that accompany these experiences. They would have seen in dreams and visions things that seem to come from a world beyond the ordinary. In all human cultures that anthropologists have studied, there is spirituality, a sense that the world contains more than the material, more than the purely practical. There is ceremony, ritual, a sense of connection to powers and beings beyond the human. These ancient people would not have been exceptions. The rock art from this period, hand stencils, animals, geometric patterns painted or carved on stone, suggests that people were expressing ideas and emotions in symbolic form. The careful placement of animal bones at certain sites suggests ritual killing and ceremony. The evidence from ancient burials, bodies arranged in particular ways, covered with ochre pigment, buried with grave goods, suggests beliefs about what happens after death and a desire to honour the dead. The peoples of the Fertile Crescent 12,000 years ago were spiritual beings, engaging in practices that went beyond mere subsistence. Yet before Göbekli Tepe, there was nothing in the archaeological record quite like what we see at the temple. Nothing that suggested that people could organise into groups large enough, coordinated enough, persistent enough, over enough time to move massive stones and create monuments. The conventional wisdom held that monuments required settled populations. Settled populations required agriculture. Agriculture emerged gradually, appearing most clearly around 10,000 years ago, roughly 2,000 years after Göbekli Tepe was built. There was a logical progression. First agriculture, then settlements, then surplus, then specialization, then monuments. The direction of history seemed clear. But what if history was not so linear? What if the causality ran differently? What if the desire to build monuments, the spiritual impulse to create something that transcended the individual and the immediate, could actually pull communities together and drive the development of new forms of social organization? What if it was possible to mobilize 100 people, to move stones and build temples without agriculture, without pottery, without the full apparatus of settled civilization? This question brings us to the heart of the mystery of Göbekli Tepe, because building this temple required something unprecedented. It required social organization on a scale that had not been seen before. It required the ability to coordinate the labour of dozens, perhaps hundreds of people, for days or weeks at a time. It required a vision compelling enough to draw people to this task, a vision so powerful that they returned again and again, that they invested their labour and their time into moving stones and building walls and creating sculptures. What was that vision? Who had it? How did they convince others to follow it? As we stand at the edge of this ancient site, imagining the world that surrounded it, we must ask these questions. We must imagine what kind of authority figure, what kind of leader, what kind of collective purpose could mobilize hunter-gatherers to undertake such a project. We must imagine the meetings and the discussions, the arguments perhaps about whether the effort was worthwhile. We must imagine the spiritual or religious conviction that made the work seem not just worth doing, but essential, a sacred duty that could not be refused. The world 12,000 years ago was not primitive. It was not simple. It was not lacking in ambition or vision. The peoples of the Fertile Crescent had survived the last ice age. They had learned to thrive in a landscape full of large and dangerous animals. They had developed elaborate technologies for hunting and gathering. They had created art, engaged in ritual, buried their dead with ceremony. They had organized themselves into communities and networks. And as the world warmed and new possibilities opened before them, they imagined and then constructed something that no one had built before. In contrast to the temperate Fertile Crescent, the rest of the world was still largely in the grip of ancient conditions. Much of Europe was only beginning to emerge from the Ice Age. The glaciers still clung to the high places. The forests were moving northward, gradually, but vast stretches remained open tundra, where hardy plants and cold-adapted animals held sway. The human populations of Europe were still following the herds, still living as mobile hunters, still producing no monumental architecture. They were not inferior to the people of the Fertile Crescent. They were just adapted to their environment, as the peoples of the Fertile Crescent were adapted to theirs. But in terms of the development of civilization, in terms of the creation of permanent settlements and monuments, the Fertile Crescent was leading the way. To the south and west, in what is now Egypt, Nubia, and the Sahara, the climate was also warming, but it was becoming more variable. The regions that would later become the vast deserts were still green enough to support human populations, though the margins were becoming tighter. The Nile had not yet been tamed by Egyptian engineers. The civilizations of the Nile Valley still lay far in the future. To the east, in what is now China and Southeast Asia, the Ice Age was receding from the landmass, but the archaeological evidence is less clear about the early developments. There were certainly people there, hunters and gatherers adapting to their environments, but the great civilizations, the Yellow River civilizations, were still thousands of years away from emerging. In the Americas, humans had arrived relatively recently, somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years ago, depending on which evidence you accept. They were spreading through North and South America, adapting to the different environments they encountered. They had survived the great megafauna extinctions that marked the end of the last ice age. They were diverse and adaptable, but they were far from the developments that were beginning in the Fertile Crescent. In this context, the Fertile Crescent stands out. It was the stage where the first great transition was beginning to occur. Göbekli Tepe, perched on its hilltop in this landscape of transition, built by people who should not have been able to build it, using knowledge and organization that should not have existed. It was the beginning of a story that would reshape human history. The temperature and light have shifted again as we linger in these ancient hills. The sun is beginning its descent toward the horizon, and the shadows of the hills grow long. You're still here, in your imagination, standing in this landscape that was the home of those who would build Göbekli Tepe. Around you is the quiet of the ancient world. No engines, no electric hum, no voices raised in anger or demand. There is the wind through the grass. There is the call of birds. There is the distant sound of water running in a creek. There is the sound of people, quiet voices, laughter, the thump of stone tools on stone, the crackling of a fire as the evening comes on. This is the world we are about to enter. This is the moment before one of the greatest mysteries of human history begins to unfold. And though we cannot know the names of the people who lived here, though we cannot hear their voices, though we cannot touch what they touched, we can stand in this landscape and sense their presence. We can imagine their lives. We can wonder at their courage and their vision. We can recognize ourselves in them, our need to create meaning, to work together towards something larger than ourselves, to leave a mark that says we were here and we mattered. and as evening settles more completely on the ancient hills, as the temperature drops and the stars begin their appearance in the darkening sky, we prepare to meet these people in the details of their greatest accomplishment. We prepare to understand the mystery of Göbekli Tepe, and through it, to understand something about the human spirit that has driven us from the beginning. The heart of Göbekli Tepe lies in its pillars. Imagine standing in a shallow valley in southern Turkey, 9,650 years before you were born, and watching something rise from the earth that shouldn't exist. Not yet, not now. These are structures that would dominate the landscape for millennia, yet they were built by people who had no cities, no domesticated animals, no written language, and no wheeled vehicles. They built with their hands, their ingenuity, and their will. The pillars are waiting for us to understand them. The most striking feature of Göbekli Tepe is undoubtedly the T-shaped limestone pillars. These are not small monuments. The largest ones stand nearly 18 feet tall, taller than a two-story house, and they weigh between 10 and 20 tons each. Some estimates suggest the heaviest reached 50 tons. They are carved from a single piece of stone, shaped into a distinctive form, a thick rectangular shaft with a rounded head-like protrusion at the top, giving the impression of a stylized human body viewed from the front. The T-shape is elegant and purposeful. There is no randomness to it. These were built with intention, with a vision held in the minds of people who gathered here, generation after generation, to realize it. Where did this stone come from? The limestone wasn't quarried from the valley floor itself. The source lay between 300 and 500 meters away from the construction sites, roughly the length of 3 football fields. The ancient workers identified outcrops of suitable limestone, assessed the grain and quality of the rock, and began the painstaking process of extraction. They had no iron tools. There were no metal chisels, no pickaxes, no devices powered by anything but human strength. Instead, they worked with flint. Flint is a stone harder than limestone, and when struck at the right angle it fractures into sharp-edged flakes. A tool made from flint could scratch, chip, and gradually wear away the softer limestone. Imagine the patience required. Imagine the knowledge encoded in generations of toolmakers, people who understood intimately how flint fractured, how it could be shaped, which angles produced the sharpest edges. But flint tools alone were slow and laborious. The workers developed another technique, one that transformed the work. They used fire. Heat was applied to the limestone bedrock, warming the stone until its structure expanded. Then, at precisely the right moment, cold water was poured over the hot rock. The sudden temperature change caused the stone to contract and crack along natural fault lines and grain boundaries. This process, called thermal shock, is still used by modern stonemasons in traditional quarrying. The ancient builders of Göbekli Tepe understood the physics of stone without understanding the physics in abstract terms. They knew it through experience, through trial and failure, through knowledge passed down in stories and demonstration. They knew that a great fire built and tended carefully could weaken the stone's bonds. They knew that water was the final partner in the breaking. They knew the timing. The precision required suggests long practice, deep familiarity with the material, and a culture that valued and preserved practical knowledge. Once the stone had been fractured by these methods, the pieces had to be further refined. The workers used the heat and water technique again in smaller applications, and they chipped away excess stone with flint tools and wooden mallets, gradually shaping the rough blocks into pillars with relatively straight sides. The stone was dressed, smoothed, refined. Some of the pillars show evidence of tremendous care in their finishing. The sides were rubbed smooth with sandstone. The top edges were rounded carefully. These weren't crude monuments. They were crafted objects. The precision of the T-shape, consistent across dozens of pillars, suggests the use of measuring devices. They may have used knotted cords, marked wooden standards, or some other system to ensure that the proportions remained true. A pillar 18 feet tall had to maintain proper balance, proper weight distribution. The head section had to align with the shoulders. This was not guesswork. This was engineering, arrived at through careful observation and repeated practice. And then came the truly monumental task, moving the stone. The pillars, weighing 10 to 20 tons, had to be transported across 300 to 500 meters of uneven ground, lowered into positions within circular enclosures, and then arranged with geometric precision. The people of Göbekli Tepe had no wheeled vehicles. Wheels hadn't been invented yet. The domestication of animals was still centuries in the future. They had no oxen, no horses, no beasts of burden. They had nothing but human muscle and ingenuity. The logistics seem impossible until you consider the solutions they likely employed. The most straightforward method would have been the use of wooden rollers, logs placed on the ground parallel to one another that would allow the pillars to roll forward as they were pushed or dragged. One end of a pillar would be lifted slightly, a roller placed beneath it, and then teams of workers would push the massive stone onto the roller. As it rolled forward, fresh rollers would be placed ahead of it, while the rollers that had already passed under the stone were picked up, carried forward and placed in front again. This process, repeated over and over, would slowly move the stone across the landscape. It would have been exhausting and slow, but with enough people, dozens, possibly hundreds, it was possible. Ropes made from plant fibres would have assisted in this process. Bark from trees could be stripped, dried, twisted and braided into strong cordage. There is evidence from this period that such ropes were manufactured. The ropes would have been attached to the pillars and used to guide their movement, to help steer them around obstacles, to assist in the final positioning. The sight of such a movement must have been extraordinary. Hundreds of people working in coordination, pulling ropes, pushing against a multi-ton block of stone, moving it inch by inch across the valley. The work would have required leadership, planning, sustained effort over many days or weeks. Some researchers have proposed the use of sledges, wooden platforms upon which the pillar would be placed, allowing it to slide rather than roll. A sledge reduces the friction between stone and ground, making the effort somewhat less intense, though still formidable. Water might have been poured on the ground in front of a sledge to further reduce friction, a technique documented in historical accounts of moving large stones. Whether the ancient builders of Göbekli Tepe used rollers, sledges, or some combination of both, the fundamental truth remains. They moved massive blocks of stone through sheer determination and human labour. The engineering knowledge displayed is sophisticated. They understood load distribution, friction, the leverage of ropes and angles. They understood how to break down an impossible-seeming task into manageable steps. Once the pillars reached their destination, they had to be raised upright and positioned within the circular enclosures. Standing a pillar upright from a horizontal position requires careful planning. One method would have involved digging a shallow socket or post hole into the ground, angling the pillar so that its base gradually moved into position, then rocking it back and forth with the help of many people until it stood upright. Wooden props and supports would have been used to hold it in place as it was raised. The precision of the positioning is remarkable. The pillars are arranged in rough circles, each enclosure containing a ring of pillars facing inward toward two larger central pillars. These circles are nearly geometrically perfect. The spacing between pillars is relatively consistent. The alignment of the T-shapes is such that they appear to face one another. This geometric precision indicates the use of some form of measuring technique and careful planning. They would have marked out the intended circle on the ground, perhaps using a rope or cord attached to a central point, measured distances from that centre point, and placed markers where each pillar should stand. The circular arrangement itself is significant. In a circle, everyone faces toward the centre, toward a focal point. In the case of Göbekli Tepe, the circle draws attention inward, toward the two larger central pillars. Whether these enclosures served ceremonial functions, functioned as gathering spaces, or held some other purpose still remains partly mysterious. But the geometry speaks to an intentionality that transcends simple shelter or storage. These spaces were designed to create a particular kind of experience for those who moved within them. The T-shape of the pillars has intrigued archaeologists and researchers since their discovery. The simplest interpretation is that the T represents a stylized human form, a head and torso. But some pillars carry this interpretation further. Carved into the limestone are details: arms, hands, belts, loincloths. Some pillars display what appear to be fingers on the hands. The level of anatomical detail, the careful carving of these features, suggests that the pillars were indeed meant to represent human figures. A person moving through these circular enclosures, surrounded by these monumental stone beings with their carved arms and heads, would experience something profoundly different from moving through a forest or across open ground. They would be in the company of these figures. They would be surrounded by stone people. Whether these figures represented ancestors, gods, spirits, or some category of being that the modern mind would find difficult to classify, we cannot say with certainty. but the intention to represent the human form seems clear. The intention to create a relationship between the living visitors to Göbekli Tepe and these stone representations seems intentional. Beyond the pillars themselves, the carvings that decorate them reveal a world of remarkable detail and artistry. The animal representations at Göbekli Tepe are not crude or simplified. They are naturalistic, observed, and rendered with an attention to anatomical detail that suggests the artists knew these animals intimately. Lions appear with bared teeth, their mouths open in snarls or roars, their bodies depicted in dynamic postures. Foxes are carved in mid-leap, their bodies stretched, their movement captured in stone. Snakes coil around pillars, their scales suggested through careful carving, their bodies twisting in lifelike curves. Wild boars are depicted with their characteristic stance, their bristles suggested through linear marks, their tusks pronounced. Scorpions appear with their tails curved over their backs. Vultures spread their wings in carved relief. Birds of various species perch or stride across the surfaces. Cranes stand with long legs and extended necks. These carvings are not random decorations. They are executed with skill and deliberation. The artists of Göbekli Tepe were observing the natural world carefully and translating that observation into stone. These animals share a crucial characteristic. They are all wild. There are no depictions of domesticated animals in the carvings of Göbekli Tepe. No sheep, no goats, no cattle, no pigs. Animals that would become central to human life after the agricultural revolution. The absence is profound. It confirms what the skeletal remains of the people and the botanical evidence of the site suggest. Göbekli Tepe was built and used by hunter-gatherers. The animals carved into the stone were the animals they hunted, the animals they observed in the landscape, the animals that populated their world. They were living in the Fertile Crescent during the moment just before agriculture, capturing in stone the creatures of the pre-farming world. In doing so, they created a kind of archive of the wild, a record of the animals that would soon retreat before human cultivation of crops and domestication of beasts. The specific animals depicted might hold symbolic meaning as well. Predators, lions, foxes, appear frequently. These were dangerous animals, formidable hunters themselves. The carving of a lion with bared teeth is not neutral. It carries a charge of power, of threat, of wildness. Perhaps these depictions were meant to capture something of the predator's strength for the people viewing them. The vultures, with their power to consume death, might have held spiritual significance. Snakes, universal symbols of transformation in the earth, are rendered with careful attention. Scorpions, dangerous desert creatures, are preserved in stone. The selection of which animals to depict was deliberate. The artists of Göbekli Tepe were telling stories through stone, encoding meaning into the fabric of their monuments. The precision required to execute these carvings should not be underestimated. Carving stone without modern tools is demanding art. The carver works with hammer and chisel, or in this case with pieces of flint and bone used as chisels, struck repeatedly with stone hammers. Progress is slow. Each blow of the hammer must be carefully placed and calibrated. Too light, and the stone doesn't budge. Too hard, and the stone fractures unpredictably. The carver must develop an intimate knowledge of the material, understanding how limestone responds to percussion, where lines of weakness run through the stone, how to work with the grain and when to work against it. The depth of the carvings varies, from shallow relief lines suggesting scales on a snake, to deeper sculptural elements creating the three-dimensional form of an animal's body. Achieving this variation required skill and planning. The artist had to visualize the finished product before beginning, and understand how to achieve the desired effect through careful, methodical work. The arrangement of multiple structures at Göbekli Tepe reveals a site that evolved over time. Archaeologists have identified at least 20 structures or enclosures, not all of which have been fully excavated. The earliest structures appear to date to around 9,650 BCE. An occupation may have continued, with interruptions until around 8,200 BCE. Over roughly 1,400 years, successive generations returned to this place, sometimes rebuilding structures in new locations, sometimes adding to existing complexes. The site shows evidence of planning and coordination across multiple generations. A tradition of monument building became established. Each new construction drew upon the knowledge and techniques developed by previous generations, but also appeared to push the boundaries, to attempt new scale and new complexity. This progression is evident in the size and sophistication of the pillars. The earlier structures feature smaller pillars. Over time, the pillars increased in size and the carvings became more elaborate. The final ambitious project was never completed. A massive pillar, estimated to weigh around 50 tons, was abandoned in the quarry, partially extracted but never removed. This pillar suggests that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were becoming more ambitious, more confident in their ability to move and erect ever larger stones. Had the site continued to be occupied and developed, the monuments might have grown to rival in scale some of the great structures of later civilizations. But something ended the occupation. Around 8,200 BCE, the site was deliberately buried. Massive amounts of earth were piled over the structures, covering them, preserving them in a kind of archaeological time capsule. The reasons for this burial remain mysterious. Was it ritual? Was it done to honour the site and mark its end? Was it practical, intended to protect the structures? The act of burial speaks to a deliberate choice, a decision to close this place and preserve it beneath the earth. The overall scale of the engineering project represented by Göbekli Tepe becomes clear only when you step back and consider the whole. The quarrying of thousands of tons of stone, the transport of massive blocks across broken terrain, the precise positioning of structures, the carving of intricate details, the coordination of labour, the planning and design work that had to precede actual construction, the training of workers and the transmission of knowledge, the gathering of resources, the organisation of people. This was not a small undertaking. This was a major project, comparable in scope to the great monuments of ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, yet accomplished without the advantages of a settled agricultural society. There were no permanent cities to serve as bases of operation. There was no centralised government to command resources and labour. There was no written system of record-keeping. Yet the project was completed, refined, elaborated, and maintained over 14 centuries. The people of Göbekli Tepe created one of the first monumental structures in human history, and they did it through pure determination, through the application of practical knowledge carefully preserved and transmitted through generations, through the coordination and cooperation of large groups of people working toward a shared vision. Standing before these pillars today, after 10,000 years, we are left to wonder at what motivated such labour. What was so important that thousands of people gave years of their lives to moving and raising stone? What ceremony or belief system commanded this devotion? What story or understanding of the world drove them to create permanent monuments in stone when the societies around them were still mobile, still moving with the seasons and the herds? The stones themselves do not answer these questions. They stand in their circles, silent, their T-shaped heads facing inward, their arms carved in stone permanently extended, their animal companions frozen in their eternal poses, leaping, snarling, coiling, flying. The pillars remain as testimony to what humans can accomplish when they commit themselves to a vision, when they organise themselves around a shared purpose, when they combine imagination with skill and determination. For a person lying down on the edge of sleep, let the weight of these stones settle into your mind. Let the image of thousands of people working together across generations fill your consciousness. Feel the heaviness, the solidity, the permanence of stone that has endured for 10,000 years and will endure for many thousand more. These monuments were built by human hands. They represent human will, human imagination, human capability. And they were created in a time we think of as ancient, as primitive, yet which produced works of remarkable sophistication and scale. Let that knowledge carry you deeper into rest, knowing that our species, in its essence, in its deepest nature, is capable of extraordinary things, and so we arrive at perhaps the greatest mystery of Göbekli Tepe, the question that has captivated researchers and archaeologists and dreamers for nearly 2 decades now. Why? Why did these people, these hunter-gatherers who had no known written language, no apparent government, no organised state structure, why did they build this? What was the purpose of this monumental undertaking that required the coordination of hundreds of people, the quarrying and shaping and transporting of stone pillars weighing tons, the planning and execution of architectural designs that showed remarkable sophistication? What moved them to do this? What force was powerful enough to compel an entire society to invest such enormous effort into a place that shows no evidence of being a permanent home, no evidence of being a settlement where people lived day to day? This is the question that keeps researchers awake at night, and as you listen to these theories in the quiet darkness, Perhaps you'll find yourself pondering it too, drifting deeper into thought, deeper into that liminal space between waking and sleep, where mysteries feel most alive. The first and perhaps most intuitive explanation is that Göbekli Tepe was a temple, a sacred place, a sanctuary. When we look at those T-shaped pillars with their mysterious carvings, when we observe the careful placement and alignment of the structures, when we see the abundance of animal imagery, the lions, the boars, the snakes, the scorpions, the vultures, it feels natural to imagine that this was a place of worship, and if it was a temple, then these animal carvings might have represented something sacred. Perhaps they were spirits. Perhaps they were cosmic forces that the hunter-gatherers sought to honor or appease. Perhaps these animals held spiritual significance in the belief systems of the people who carved them. The T-shaped pillars themselves, standing upright like sentinels, might have been more than architectural features. Some researchers have speculated that these pillars represent human or divine figures. Perhaps they were ancestors. Perhaps they were protective beings, deities that watched over the place and the people who gathered there. This interpretation makes sense on an almost intuitive level. Humans have always built temples. We have always sought to create spaces that feel separate from the ordinary world, spaces where something sacred happens. The impulse to build a sanctuary seems to run through our species like a golden thread connecting past to present. If this interpretation is correct, then Göbekli Tepe marks the moment when hunter-gatherers first channeled that impulse into monumental form. It would be the birth of the temple as we know it, the first time humans collectively decided to build a permanent structure devoted entirely to spiritual purposes. The implications are staggering. It would mean that the human need for the sacred, for spiritual meaning, for communal worship is far older and far deeper than anyone had previously imagined. It would mean that thousands of years before agriculture, before cities, before civilization as we traditionally define it, people were already asking the big questions. What is this universe? What forces shape our existence? How do we relate to the natural world around us? How do we come together in shared belief? If the temple theory is correct, Göbekli Tepe was the answer. It was their answer. It was the space they created to explore these eternal human questions. But there is another theory, one that speaks to a different but equally fundamental human need. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was not a temple in the sense of a place dedicated to worship of deities. Perhaps it was a gathering place, a ceremonial centre, a place where different bands of hunter-gatherers, dispersed across the landscape for much of the year, came together for something equally important to humans: connection, community, alliance. We know from the archaeological record that Göbekli Tepe was not a permanent settlement. There are no houses, no domestic structures, no kitchens or sleeping quarters. But the evidence is overwhelming that many people came here at different times, and when they came to feast. The bones tell this story. Archaeologists have uncovered vast quantities of animal bones at the site, the remains of meals consumed by hundreds of people. The animals included gazelles, boars, snakes, and birds. The quantity of bones suggests feasting on a monumental scale, celebrations that went on for days, perhaps weeks. Imagine the scene. Different groups of hunter-gatherers, who might normally encounter each other only occasionally, who might speak different dialects, who might have competing claims to hunting territories, coming together at this special place for a shared purpose. Perhaps these gatherings served practical functions. Perhaps alliances were formed. Perhaps marriages were arranged. Perhaps trade took place. Perhaps disputes were resolved. But more than anything, perhaps these gatherings served a social function that is even more fundamental. They reminded people that they were not alone, that they were part of something larger than their own band, their own family, their own immediate group. In a world where humans were still scattered in small bands across the landscape, where true cities did not yet exist, where the modern sense of civilization was still millennia away, these gatherings at Göbekli Tepe might have been some of the largest assemblies of human beings that had ever occurred. Imagine standing among hundreds of other people, all gathered in this sacred place, all participating in shared rituals and shared meals. Imagine the feeling of belonging to something larger than yourself. Imagine the power of that experience. Some researchers believe that these feasting gatherings were not random occurrences but were carefully planned and anticipated events. Perhaps they occurred at specific times of the year, at certain seasonal intersections when the animals hunted were abundant. Perhaps different groups took turns hosting these gatherings, each group contributing its resources and labour. Perhaps the monuments themselves, the pillars, the walls, the sculptures, were created by the collective effort of many different groups working together, and the very act of building was part of the bonding process. If this theory is correct, then Göbekli Tepe was less a temple and more a ceremonial centre, a place where humans did what we have always done when we gather together. We celebrated, we communed, we reinforced our bonds with each other. We created meaning through shared experience, and in doing so we created something that endured, something that was important enough to maintain across generations. There is a third theory, more speculative perhaps, but no less intriguing. Some researchers believe that Göbekli Tepe may have been an astronomical observatory, that among the many carvings and arrangements of stones, there are alignments that speak to the stars, that the people who built this place were not merely seeking spiritual connection or social gathering, but were also attempting to understand and map the heavens above them. This theory requires us to imagine hunter-gatherers as astronomers, as observers and record-keepers of celestial phenomena. And yet, why should this surprise us? Modern indigenous peoples around the world have demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of the stars and planets. Ancient cultures that came after Göbekli Tepe, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Mayans, all invested enormous effort in astronomical observation and calculation. Why should we assume that the hunter-gatherers of Anatolia, with their monumental architecture and their apparent capacity for planning and coordination, were not also interested in the cosmos? Some of the carvings at Göbekli Tepe do appear to relate to astronomical phenomena. The positioning of certain pillars and structures suggests possible alignments with celestial events, with the rising or setting of particular stars at certain times of the year. And then there is the matter of Pillar 43, the so-called vulture stone, one of the most enigmatic carvings at the entire site. This stone is covered with symbolic carvings that have fascinated and perplexed researchers. At the centre is a vulture, a large bird with outstretched wings. The vulture appears to be carrying or holding a circle, which some researchers interpret as the sun, or the moon, or some other celestial body. Nearby is a headless human figure. There is a scorpion. There are other animals and symbols whose meanings remain unclear. What does this image represent? What story was the artist trying to tell? This question has generated considerable speculation, and one of the most extraordinary theories comes from a researcher named Martin Sweatman. Sweatman and his colleagues have proposed that the vulture stone and several other carved images at Göbekli Tepe may be depicting a specific astronomical event. Not a recurrent event like the rising of a star, but a unique, catastrophic, world-changing event. Specifically, they suggest that the vulture stone may be depicting a comet strike or a major meteor shower that occurred around 10,900 BCE. This date is significant because it marks the beginning of a period known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden and dramatic return to Ice Age conditions that lasted for more than 1,000 years. During the Younger Dryas, global temperatures plummeted. Ice sheets that had been melting and retreating rapidly suddenly began advancing again. Vegetation patterns shifted. Animal populations migrated or died off. For human populations around the world, the Younger Dryas was a catastrophe. Food sources disappeared or became unreliable. Climates that had been gradually warming and becoming more predictable suddenly became harsh and unpredictable again. Many populations struggled to survive. Some may have gone extinct. According to Sweatman's theory, the impact or impacts that triggered the Younger Dryas were observed by humans in the Near East. The sky would have darkened with smoke and dust. Fireballs would have streaked across the heavens. The sun itself would have been obscured. There might have been massive explosions, earthquakes, fires. It would have been among the most terrifying events in human history. The vulture stone, in this interpretation, is a record of that catastrophe. The vulture holding the sun or the circle might represent the darkening of the sky, the obscuring of the sun. The headless human figure might represent the death and destruction. The other animals and symbols might represent additional aspects of the disaster. The vulture itself, a bird that feeds on corpses, might be a fitting symbol for a catastrophe that killed many. If this interpretation is correct, then Göbekli Tepe was built as a response to this catastrophe, as a place where people gathered to process the trauma, to create meaning out of devastation, to commemorate the event that nearly destroyed them. The carvings on the vulture stone would be a form of collective memory, a way of ensuring that the story of this tremendous event was not forgotten. It is a haunting theory, one that reminds us that even in the distant past humans experienced world-changing disasters and created culture and meaning in response to them. But perhaps the most revolutionary theory about Göbekli Tepe goes even deeper, extends its implications even further. This theory challenges the entire narrative of human history that we have inherited, the story we tell ourselves about how civilization arose. For generations, scholars have operated under a particular assumption about the order of things. First comes agriculture. Humans settle down, plant crops, domesticate animals. This allows larger populations to be supported in smaller areas. Settlements grow into villages, villages into cities. With the surplus created by farming, some people no longer need to hunt and gather. They can specialize. Some become priests, some become rulers, some become craftspeople. And with specialization comes the need for organization, for leadership, for rules. Religion develops to sanctify this order, to explain why some people rule and others obey. In this narrative, civilization causes religion. Government creates the need for spiritual justification. Agriculture enables the temple. The progression is clear. Farming, then civilization, then organized religion. This is the story we have been told, and it has shaped how we understand human history. But what if the order is wrong? What if religion came first? What if Göbekli Tepe, this monumental temple built by hunter-gatherers, is evidence that humans created organized religion thousands of years before they created agriculture? What if religion did not emerge as a product of civilization, but was instead one of the driving forces that led to civilization? This is the theory that many researchers now find compelling. The evidence for this theory lies in what we do not find at Göbekli Tepe. There is no evidence of permanent habitation. There are no houses. There is no evidence of agriculture. There are no domestic plants or animals. There is no evidence of people living here year-round. The site was visited, yes. Large gatherings occurred here, yes. But people did not make their homes here. Yet they invested extraordinary effort in maintaining and expanding the structures, in creating and refining the sculptures and carvings, in gathering people together at regular intervals. Why would they do this if it was not important? Why would people continue to come back to this place, across decades and centuries, to feast and gather and create, if the motivation was not powerful? The only motivation powerful enough seems to be a spiritual or religious one. People came here because they believed they had to. They came here because something sacred was happening here. They came here because their spiritual needs drew them here, more powerfully than material considerations. And if religion was this important, if it was important enough to organize people on a monumental scale, to coordinate labor and planning across large areas, to compel people to return again and again, then perhaps religion was also what eventually led to agriculture. Perhaps as populations grew around these religious centers, as the need to feed more people at these gatherings increased, people began to experiment with farming. Perhaps they domesticated animals not for general sustenance, but because feasting was so central to the religious gatherings. Perhaps they developed agriculture because the religious imperative to gather in larger and larger numbers created a need for more reliable food sources. If this is true, then the traditional narrative is backwards. It is not that religion developed as a consequence of farming and civilization. Rather, agriculture developed as a consequence of religion. We developed farming not because we suddenly became clever enough to invent it, but because we felt compelled to feed ourselves, to maintain our spiritual practices. We created civilization not because farming made it possible, but because religion made it necessary. This is a revolutionary idea, and it reframes Göbekli Tepe from being an isolated archaeological wonder to being potentially the origin point of everything that followed. It suggests that Göbekli Tepe was not just a temple, but was the birthplace of organized religion itself. It was the moment when humans first created a permanent spiritual center, the moment when we first institutionalized our spiritual impulses. And that moment, that revolutionary moment, set in motion all of the developments that led to everything we know about human civilization. This theory reminds us that we are creatures of spirit as much as we are creatures of matter. It suggests that our deepest needs and desires, the need to understand our place in the cosmos, the need to come together in shared belief, the need to create meaning and transcendence, these needs are not products of civilization, but are instead among the deepest and most ancient parts of what makes us human. They are old enough to have moved our ancestors to carve stone and raise pillars and gather in the darkness, looking up at the stars, seeking to understand the great mysteries that have always haunted and inspired us. The builders of Göbekli Tepe have left us with questions more precious than any answer. They have left us with a mystery that reminds us that our history is longer and stranger and more spiritual than we often remember. They have left us with structures that speak to something eternal in the human spirit, something that transcends any particular time or place. And as you listen to these words in the quiet darkness, as you rest your mind and prepare to drift off to sleep, perhaps you can feel some echo of what those ancient people felt. Perhaps you can sense, just a little, the awe and wonder they must have experienced in that place. Perhaps you can imagine the moments of transcendence, when hundreds of people gathered under the stars at Göbekli Tepe, connected by something larger than themselves, participating in rituals and ceremonies whose exact meanings have been lost to time, but whose power still resonates through the archaeological record, still speaks to us across the 12,000 years that separate us from them. This is the gift that Göbekli Tepe gives us. It reminds us that we are part of a very long story, and that the deepest parts of that story are still mysterious, still unknown, still capable of capturing our imagination and wonder. If you're still awake and enjoying this journey into the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe, consider subscribing to the Calm Archive. A like really does help more people find these videos when they can't sleep, and if you found yourself drifting off during this section, that's perfect too. You've heard the theories, you've pondered the mysteries, and perhaps you've drifted toward dreams. Now let's get back to the mystery of Göbekli Tepe and discover what the builders left behind for us, what evidence they left in stone and bone and carved images for us to slowly, patiently uncover. But here is where the story of Göbekli Tepe takes a turn towards something that might feel almost haunting, in the gentlest possible way. Because after roughly 1,500 years of use, after generations had gathered in those T-shaped pillared circles, after the carvings had accumulated and deepened, after this place had clearly become central to how these hunter-gatherers understood themselves and their world, the people who built it made a deliberate choice. They chose to bury it, all of it. Every single enclosure, every pillar, every ceremonial space that had taken such tremendous effort to construct was intentionally, systematically filled in with soil and rubble and animal bones and discarded stone tools. They covered it up completely and walked away. And perhaps this is the deepest mystery of Göbekli Tepe of all, deeper than the pillars themselves, deeper than the question of how it was built. The question becomes, why would anyone do such a thing? Why would a society invest such enormous resources in constructing something, maintaining it, using it for centuries and centuries, and then deliberately, methodically fill it all in with earth? It's a question that has captivated archaeologists and historians, and anyone who has sat with the strangeness of this place, trying to understand not just the past, but the minds of the people who lived in it. Klaus Schmidt spent years contemplating this single aspect of Göbekli Tepe. He knew that the burial had to be intentional, the way the fill was layered, the systematic way the enclosures were covered, the careful placement of soil and stone. This wasn't natural erosion or collapse. This was choice. There are several theories that archaeologists have developed, each one opening up different windows into what might have been happening at that moment in time when the decision was made to cover everything over. The first theory is almost comforting in its practical simplicity. They buried Göbekli Tepe to preserve it. Perhaps the people who used this temple understood that something precious was being lost. Perhaps their way of life was changing, and they wanted to protect what they had built for future generations, the way we might place a time capsule in the ground. Maybe they covered it hoping that someday, thousands of years later, someone would uncover it and understand what they had done. There's something beautiful about this idea, something that suggests a kind of backward-looking reverence, an understanding that what they were creating had value that would outlast them. But there are other theories, and some of them feel darker, or at least more mystical. Perhaps the burial was not about preservation, but about closure, about ending something deliberately because its time had come. In many spiritual traditions across human cultures, there is the concept of ritual completion, of saying goodbye to something sacred by burying it, or burning it, or returning it to the earth. Perhaps the people of Göbekli Tepe had come to believe that the temple's purpose had been fulfilled, or that its power needed to be contained, sealed away, returned to the earth from which it came. Maybe they believed that temples, like living things, had life cycles, birth, growth, maturity, and then death, and that the responsible thing to do was to return it to the earth when its time was finished. Another theory, one that feels especially poignant, is that the burial itself was a ritual closing, a ceremony that marked the end of an era. Perhaps there was a gathering, one final gathering in the enclosures before they were filled in, where the people acknowledged what they were letting go of. Perhaps it was a funeral of sorts, a funeral for a way of life, a way of organising society around these massive ceremonial centres. Perhaps they filled in the temple deliberately because they had to, because something fundamental was changing. And here is where we touch on something that might be the most profound truth, hidden within Göbekli Tepe. The people who buried it were likely the same people who were in the process of transforming their entire way of living. The hills around Göbekli Tepe, the very landscape in which this temple sits, are part of the Fertile Crescent, one of the birthplaces of agriculture itself. Wild wheat grew in these hills. In the valleys nearby, some of the very first experiments in farming were taking place. Just 20 miles away from Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists have found evidence of the oldest known domesticated wheat. And the timing is not coincidental. Even as Göbekli Tepe was reaching its zenith, even as the pillared enclosures were being used and maintained, the agricultural revolution was beginning to take root in the soil around it. Perhaps then, the burial of Göbekli Tepe was not a choice made in isolation. Perhaps it was a choice made as part of a larger transformation, as hunter-gatherers were beginning to settle down, to plant crops, to build villages instead of gathering at monumental temples. Perhaps the people who buried Göbekli Tepe understood, on some level, that the age of the hunter-gatherer was ending, that the new age of the farmer was beginning, and that the old ways, including the old temples, would no longer be necessary. Maybe they buried it as a farewell to themselves, to the identity they were shedding like a skin. And here's the remarkable irony, the beautiful accident at the heart of this story. The burial that might have been an ending, a letting go, a recognition that something could no longer be maintained. The burial itself became the greatest act of preservation imaginable. The fill material that covered Göbekli Tepe protected those carvings, those pillars, those intricate sculptures from the rain and wind and erosion that would have destroyed them. For 10,000 years, while everything else on the surface of the earth was weathering and breaking down, Göbekli Tepe was cradled in the earth, preserved in a cocoon of soil and stone. The very act of burying it, which might have been intended as an ending, ensured that it would endure, that it would be available for us to find and wonder at thousands of years later. The temple was protected not by being left open to the sky, but by being returned to the earth. What makes this preservation even more remarkable is the condition of what was found. The carvings, and we need to linger on this, the carvings are still sharp. The details are still visible. The nuances that show the artist's hand are still there to see. If Göbekli Tepe had been left exposed, all of that would have been smoothed away by wind and weather and the passage of 10 millennia. The limestone would have weathered down to almost nothing. But instead the carvings remain, waiting for us in the darkness of the earth, as if the people who buried them knew that they would be found again, and they wanted us to be able to read the work of their hands. The layers of Göbekli Tepe tell us something else, something that seems to contradict everything we thought we knew about how civilization progresses. Archaeologists have identified 3 main periods of construction and use, what they call Layer 3, Layer 2 and Layer 1, and they can roughly date them. Layer 3, the oldest layer, dates to around 9,600 BCE, and Layer 3 is quite simply the most impressive. The enclosures are the largest, the pillars are the most precisely shaped, the carvings are the most sophisticated and detailed. The effort invested is staggering, and then, as we move up through the layers, as we move forward in time, and here is the strange part, things get smaller. The enclosures in Layer 2, which dates to around 8,000 BCE, are noticeably smaller. The pillars are less precisely worked. The carvings are less detailed. The effort seems to have diminished, and this is absolutely backwards from everything we expect. In every other archaeological site, in every other human society we study, the pattern is that things get more sophisticated over time. Technology improves. Architecture becomes more refined. Carvings become more detailed. Society becomes more complex. The default narrative of human history is one of improvement, of increasing sophistication, of building on the knowledge of previous generations. But at Göbekli Tepe, we see the opposite. We see the earliest period being the most sophisticated, and then a gradual decline. We see the skills being less refined as time goes on, the structures being smaller, the ambition seemingly lessening. What does this mean? What does it tell us about what was happening in these hills, in these valleys, during these crucial centuries in human history? One possibility is that the skills were simply being lost. Perhaps the knowledge of how to precisely carve these pillars, how to shape them and transport them and arrange them, was not being passed down as faithfully as it once was. Perhaps the master stoneworkers of the earliest period had no successors, or their successors were less skilled, and with each generation the knowledge degraded. But that seems too simple an explanation. It doesn't account for why the ambition would diminish along with the skill. If the knowledge was still valued, wouldn't people find a way to preserve it? A more intriguing possibility is that the society itself was changing. Perhaps the people of Göbekli Tepe had always been planning to transition away from the hunter-gatherer way of life, and the deliberate burial of the temple was not a sudden choice, but the culmination of a long-term shift. Perhaps as more people began to stay in one place and farm, there was less need for a massive central gathering place. Perhaps the values that had made Göbekli Tepe so important were gradually being displaced by new values, the values of settlement, of storage, of property and inheritance. Perhaps the decline in the temple's grandeur reflects the decline in its importance to the community that had built it. And this brings us back to the agricultural revolution, to that nearby wild wheat, to the farms that were being planted in the Fertile Crescent while Göbekli Tepe was still being used. There is a fascinating theory that some archaeologists have proposed. What if the process of building and maintaining Göbekli Tepe, the process of organizing large numbers of people, of feeding them, of getting them to work together on a massive project, what if that process itself taught people the fundamentals of agriculture? What if tending to this monumental temple, this gathering place that required constant maintenance and organization, what if that is what led to the cultivation of crops? In other words, what if the agricultural revolution was not something that simply happened to the people of the Fertile Crescent, but something that grew directly out of the social organization that Göbekli Tepe had created, feeding 100 people or 200 people or more who are gathering for ceremonies and construction? How do you do that reliably, year after year, with only the food you can hunt and gather? You begin to think about storage. You begin to manage food supplies. You begin to experiment with planting seeds near your gathering place, cultivating patches of wild wheat, selecting for the seeds that produce the largest grain. You learn to predict when plants will be ready to harvest. You learn to plan ahead. And suddenly, you have invented agriculture. This is speculative, but it's the kind of speculation that feels grounded in the archaeological evidence. The timeline matches, the location matches, the social organization required for Göbekli Tepe matches the kind of organization that would enable the first experiments with farming. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was not just a temple. Perhaps it was the incubator of civilization itself, the place where humans learned to organize themselves in ways that would eventually transform how we live on this planet. And by the time the people realized what they had set in motion, by the time they understood that the age of the hunter-gatherer was ending and the age of the farmer was beginning, maybe they felt it was appropriate to bury their great temple, to say goodbye to it, to close one chapter and open another, to return it to the earth that had supported them for so long. The burial of Göbekli Tepe, then, might be not a mystery at all, but an act of profound intentionality, a recognition that the time had come for something new, a farewell to the past. But Göbekli Tepe was not alone. In the last 20 years especially, archaeologists have discovered other sites in the region with similar features, similar construction techniques, similar mysterious purposes. There is Karahan Tepe, discovered relatively recently, perhaps 200 kilometers to the east of Göbekli Tepe, and it too has T-shaped pillars. It too has been carefully arranged in enclosures. It too shows evidence of careful stonework and purposeful design. The pillars at Karahan Tepe are smaller than those at Göbekli Tepe, and the site seems to be somewhat later in date, but the similarities are unmistakable. This suggests that Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated phenomenon, not a one-off creation by a unique group of people, but rather the most famous example of a much larger phenomenon, a whole network of ceremonial sites, perhaps spread across the Fertile Crescent and beyond. There is also Saburs, another site in the same region, with underground chambers and carved pillars showing similar artistic techniques to those at Göbekli Tepe. The T-shaped forms appear again and again, the careful stonework, the clear evidence of artistic intention and religious significance. It's as if we are seeing for the first time the true scope of this pre-agricultural religious revolution. There were multiple sites. There was a whole tradition. There was a culture, a network, a shared set of beliefs and practices that stretched across the landscape, connecting communities that might have otherwise been isolated. And this makes us wonder, if there was such a network, what held it together? How did these communities coordinate? How did they share knowledge and techniques and religious ideas? Were there pilgrimages? Did people travel from Karahan Tepe to Göbekli Tepe for special ceremonies? Were there specialist craftspeople who moved from site to site, teaching their skills, learning from others? The discovery of these sister sites raises almost as many questions as Göbekli Tepe itself does, but it also tells us something important. We're not looking at a quirk of history, not at a single strange moment when a group of people built something magnificent and inexplicable. We are looking at the evidence of a whole civilization, a whole worldview, a whole way of organizing society that flourished for centuries before agriculture, before writing, before the things we usually think of as civilization. And then it was all buried, or at least the most famous parts of it were. The temples were covered, the sites were abandoned, the knowledge faded, and for 10,000 years the earth kept these secrets, until a man named Klaus Schmidt, moved by a hunch and supported by careful science, decided to dig in a certain place in southeastern Turkey, where shepherds had long known that there was something strange in the ground, something worth looking at, something that felt important, even if no one could quite explain why. If the Calm Archive has become part of your bedtime routine, I'd love it if you shared this video with someone who might need it tonight. And hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Now, where were we? We were in the darkness beneath the earth, in the spaces between the filled-in enclosures, in the moment when a civilization made a choice that echoes across 10,000 years. We were asking what it means to bury something deliberately, what it means to say goodbye to an old way of life, what it means to plant the seeds, literally and figuratively, of a new one. And as you lie there in the darkness of your own room, perhaps in the darkness before sleep, perhaps in that liminal space between waking and dreaming, you might think about all the choices that humanity has made, all the temples we have built and the ones we have buried, all the chapters we have closed and the ones we have opened. You might think about what it would feel like to be part of that ancient community, to know that something precious was ending, and to mark that ending with the careful, deliberate act of returning it to the earth. The story of Göbekli Tepe is not really about stones and pillars, although those are there, real and tangible beneath the ground. It is about human meaning, about the ways we gather together to make sense of the world, about the monuments we build and the reasons we build them, and what it all means when we step back and see the larger pattern. It is about civilization not as something that was inevitable, not as something that had to happen the way it did, but as a choice, or rather a series of choices, made by real people who were trying to understand their place in the world, trying to connect with something larger than themselves, trying to create something that would last. And in some ways, it did last. The temple was buried, yes, but it was not destroyed. The pillars are still there. The carvings are still there. The evidence of human intention and human effort and human wonder is still there, waiting beneath the soil. And someday, if we choose to look carefully enough, if we choose to listen to what the earth is trying to tell us, we can uncover these stories. We can read the messages that were carved 10,000 years ago. We can understand, or at least sense, what the people of Göbekli Tepe were feeling, what they were thinking, what they were trying to say to us across the vast expanse of time. So as you settle deeper into sleep, as the world around you grows quieter and smaller, imagine the earth beneath you. Imagine all the things that have been buried in that earth. Imagine all the temples and all the choices and all the chapters of human history that are held in the ground around us, waiting. And know that even though Göbekli Tepe was buried, even though its age passed and a new age began, something of it remains. Something of what those people created, something of what they meant, something of their reaching toward the sky and toward each other. Something of that remains. It remains in the stones. It remains in the stories. It remains in the human impulse to build, to gather, to make meaning, to say something that will last beyond our time on this earth. And that impulse, that reaching, that is something we all carry with us, even in sleep, even in dreams. When Klaus Schmidt first stood at Göbekli Tepe and realized what he was looking at, something shifted in the archaeological world. Not immediately, and not without resistance, but inevitably. Because what this site revealed wasn't just another discovery to file away in the archive of human history. It was an entire reordering of how we understand ourselves, our motivations, and the very story we tell about where we came from. Let yourself settle into this moment now, knowing that you're learning about something that truly changed how science sees our species. There's comfort in that, isn't there? The comfort of knowing that human beings have always been driven by something more than mere survival. Even in the deepest past, even when life was difficult and uncertain, we were creating, we were building, we were reaching towards something transcendent. The old story was neat. It was clean. It fit into a logical progression that made sense in lecture halls and textbooks, and it told us something reassuring about human development. For decades, the dominant narrative went like this. First came agriculture. Before agriculture, humans were nomadic hunter-gatherers, moving from place to place, living in small bands, focused entirely on the daily work of finding food and staying alive. Then, agriculture arrived. Settlements followed naturally from farming, because you can't harvest crops and move on at the same time. With permanent settlements, specialization became possible. Some people farmed, some made tools, some organized labor, and from that organization came social complexity, hierarchies, leaders, and eventually the structures we recognize as civilization. Temples, monuments, art, writing, all of it flowed from the agricultural surplus. Religion too was secondary. It emerged from the leisure time that agriculture provided, from the need to explain the world and maintain social order once society became large and complex enough to need such explanations. This was the sequence that dominated for so long. Agriculture, settlement, complexity, then religion and monuments. It made logical sense. It seemed like a natural progression from simple to complex, from survival to civilization. And then Göbekli Tepe presented a problem. Because here was a massive religious monument, built 12,000 years ago, constructed by people who were not farmers. There were no crops growing here. There was no agricultural surplus to support the labour. These were hunter-gatherers, people who left no evidence of permanent settlement, people who by the old model shouldn't have had the time, the motivation, or the social organisation to build anything like this. And yet they did. They built something monumental, they built something sacred. They built something that required planning, cooperation, skill, and a vision that extended far beyond the immediate needs of survival. The implications are staggering when you sit with them for a moment. This means that religion didn't emerge from agriculture. It didn't arise as a byproduct of civilization. Instead, it appears that human beings were building temples, creating ritual spaces, gathering for religious purposes, long before they ever planted a single crop. Religion, the impulse to create sacred spaces and gather in groups to worship something greater than ourselves, may not be a luxury that comes with civilization. It may be something far more fundamental. It may be something woven into the fabric of human consciousness itself. The desire to reach beyond ourselves, to create meaning, to build monuments to the sacred, appears to be hardwired into who we are as a species. This is humbling, isn't it? There's something deeply calming about recognizing that for thousands of generations, your ancestors carried this same impulse, the same longing, the same need to build something that would outlast them. Klaus Schmidt understood this when he first grasped what Göbekli Tepe was. He understood that his discovery had cracked open the old textbook and revealed something the pages didn't account for. He spoke about this realization with wonder and precision, describing how the site forced archaeologists to reconsider the entire trajectory of human development. The old model wasn't just incomplete, it was fundamentally wrong. It put the cart before the horse. It assumed that the practical had to come before the spiritual, that survival had to be solved before meaning could be created. But Göbekli Tepe demonstrated that meaning and spirituality weren't later developments, weren't luxuries for civilized peoples. They were present from the beginning. They were essential. They drove human behavior and motivated human effort in ways that the purely materialist interpretation of archaeology had underestimated. Schmidt's discovery didn't just add a new site to the map, it reordered the entire foundation of how we understand human nature and human history. And that reordering continues to ripple outward, changing how we see ourselves. The excavations themselves have been ongoing for decades now, and they continue to reveal more layers of complexity and mystery. But here's something crucial to understand as you rest with this. The excavation of Göbekli Tepe is far from complete. In fact, it's barely begun. Archaeologists estimate that only about 5% of the site has been excavated so far. 5%. Let that sink in for a moment. Everything you've learned so far, All the enclosures, all the pillars, all the artifacts and the insights they've provided, all of that comes from just 5% of the site, underground, buried beneath the earth, waiting patiently through the centuries and millennia, are the remains of perhaps 15 to 20 more enclosures. Structures as massive and as intricate as the ones that have already been uncovered. Stone foundations, organized spaces, evidence of rituals and gatherings that we haven't even begun to explore. The potential for discovery is enormous. The potential for Göbekli Tepe to reveal even more about these ancient people is vast and largely untapped. Modern technology has only deepened this sense of hidden potential. Ground-penetrating radar has been used to map the subsurface of the site, and the results have confirmed what the archaeologists suspected. Massive structures lie beneath the ground. Walls, enclosures, organized architectural features that follow patterns similar to what's been excavated, suggesting a systematic design to the entire sacred complex. The Earth has preserved these things perfectly, keeping them safe from erosion and exposure, storing them for the day when we might finally be ready to understand them. Imagine that as you lie in the darkness and stillness of this moment. Imagine those stone structures, resting in the earth, undisturbed, waiting. There's something almost protective about it, isn't there? The earth holding these secrets, keeping them safe until we develop the tools and the wisdom to study them properly. When ground-penetrating radar reveals these hidden walls and foundations, it's like being given a glimpse of a vast map, a blueprint for a sacred landscape that stretches far beyond what we can see from the surface. And this is just the beginning. Decades of excavation lie ahead, entire seasons of careful work, brushstroke by brushstroke, revealing what these ancient people built. In 2018, Göbekli Tepe received the formal recognition of UNESCO World Heritage status. This wasn't just bureaucratic acknowledgement, it was the world's way of saying, this site matters. This site is precious. This site is part of our shared human heritage, and it deserves to be preserved and protected for future generations. The designation came with funding, with international attention, with a formal commitment to ensuring that Göbekli Tepe would be studied carefully and protected from damage. The Turkish government and the international archaeological community worked together to secure this recognition, understanding that what lies at this site is not just scientifically important, but culturally and spiritually significant. It's a place where the world comes to study the roots of human spirituality and human creativity, and that recognition carries weight. It signals that we, as a global community, believe Göbekli Tepe matters, that these ancient people's efforts to build something sacred deserve to be remembered and honoured. But the story of Göbekli Tepe is not one of universal consensus and settled truth. Within the archaeological community, healthy debate continues. Not everyone agrees with every interpretation. Some archaeologists push back against calling Göbekli Tepe a temple. They suggest alternative explanations. Maybe it was a settlement, they argue, and the evidence for permanent habitation is simply not yet fully understood. Maybe we're wrong about the dating, and this site is actually younger than we think, meaning agriculture was already being practiced here or nearby. Maybe the impressive stone structures had a more mundane purpose than we've imagined. Maybe they were defensive structures, or communal workspaces, or something else entirely that we haven't yet considered. These are not unreasonable questions. Science progresses through healthy debate, through pushing back against assumptions, through asking difficult questions about the evidence. And the truth is that archaeology is an interpretive science. We work with fragments. We work with what remains. We make educated guesses based on context and comparison. And sometimes those guesses can be wrong, or incomplete, or subject to different interpretations. The debate about Göbekli Tepe is actually a sign of good scholarship. It means that archaeologists are taking the site seriously enough to question it, to examine the evidence carefully, to consider alternative explanations. This is how knowledge advances, and even in the midst of the debate, certain things remain clear. The pillars are real. The organization of the structures is real. The age of the site, confirmed by multiple dating methods, is real. The amount of labor required to move and arrange these stones, the skill required to carve the reliefs, the planning required to organize the space into distinct enclosures, all of this is real and undeniable. So even as archaeologists debate about the temple interpretation, or the exact function of the site, the fundamental fact remains. These ancient people created something extraordinary. They invested enormous energy and skill into building something that would endure. That much is beyond dispute. What remains mysterious, though, what keeps the site eternally fascinating, is all the things we still don't know. Who exactly were these people? Not just where they lived or what tools they used, but who were they as humans? What were their personalities like? Did they have a sense of humour? Did they compose songs or tell stories? We may never know. What language did they speak? What did it sound like? How did they organise themselves socially? Were there leaders, priests, councils? How did decisions get made? How did they convince people to invest the enormous effort required to build these structures? What did they believe? This is perhaps the most tantalising question of all. What exactly did the people of Göbekli Tepe believe they were doing when they carved these animals into stone and arranged them in these enclosures? What god or gods did they pray to? What stories did they tell? What did these creatures represent? The foxes, the boars, the snakes, did they represent dangers, helpers, divine beings, symbols of some spiritual concept we can't now fathom? We can make educated guesses, but we cannot know. The spiritual interior of their world is lost to us, closed off by the gulf of 12,000 years. And what happened to them? This too remains a mystery. The site was deliberately buried, as we've discussed. But then what? Did the people who built these enclosures continue to live in the region? Did they eventually settle down and take up agriculture? Did they scatter and disappear into the vast landscape of the ancient Middle East? Did their descendants eventually become the farmers of the Fertile Crescent, carrying with them the memory of the temple at Göbekli Tepe? Or did they vanish entirely, leaving only their monuments to hint at their existence? We simply don't know. And then there's the question of decline that we touched on earlier. Why did the quality of the craftsmanship decrease over time? The earliest pillars, the ones from the deepest layers, are often the most precisely carved, the most skilled in execution. As time goes on, the later structures show less refined work, less attention to detail. Does this indicate a decline in the population, a loss of knowledge, a shift in priorities, a crisis of some kind? Or is it simply that our assumptions about craftsmanship and its relationship to time are flawed? Perhaps the earlier structures were built during a period of great abundance or motivation, and later structures were built under different circumstances. Perhaps different groups built different enclosures, and they had different skill levels or different aesthetic values. The decline in craftsmanship raises as many questions as it answers, and the largest mystery of all remains unanswered. Why did they bury it? This act of deliberate covering seems to suggest intention. They didn't simply abandon the site and move on. They took the time and effort to bury it, to cover it with earth, to hide it from view. Why? Was it a sacred act, a way of honouring the site and ensuring it would be preserved? Was it practical, a way of managing erosion or protecting the structures? Was it ritual, something with spiritual significance? Was it one of those mysteries that we may never solve, an act whose motivation is locked inside the minds of people who lived 12,000 years ago? The covering of Göbekli Tepe will likely remain forever enigmatic, a final gift of mystery left by these ancient people for us to ponder. What we can say with certainty, though, is this. Göbekli Tepe stands as evidence that human beings have always been more than merely practical. We have always been driven by more than survival. Even in the deepest past, even when food was uncertain and life was difficult, we were artists. We were creators. We were spiritual beings. We were architects of meaning. We were ambitious. We were capable of organising large groups of people around a shared vision. We were capable of creating something beautiful and complex just for the sake of it, just because we felt moved to do so. These were not primitive people in any meaningful sense. They were fully human. They had imagination. They had passion. They had the capacity to dream of something greater than themselves and the skill to bring those dreams partially into material form. This is what Göbekli Tepe reveals, not just about them, but about us, about who we are as a species, about what drives us, about the permanence of certain human qualities across the entire span of our existence. When you consider Göbekli Tepe in this broader context, when you understand it as a statement about human nature and human potential, something shifts in how you see the world. It becomes a testament to the creative impulse that lives in all of us. It becomes a reminder that art and spirituality and meaning-making are not luxuries or additions to human life. They're essential. They've always been essential. Even at the beginning of the recorded story of human civilization, they were central. The people of Göbekli Tepe didn't build their temples as a side project. something to do in their spare time after the serious business of survival was taken care of. They built them as a central project, as the point around which their lives revolved, as the thing that mattered most, and that suggests something profound about what human beings are and what we need in order to truly flourish. We need more than food and shelter. We need meaning. We need community. We need to create. We need to reach beyond ourselves towards something transcendent. And now imagine yourself standing on that hilltop at Göbekli Tepe, but place yourself 12,000 years ago in the time when the monument still stood open to the sky, when the stone pillars were freshly carved and the site was active and alive with meaning. It's night. The stars overhead are impossibly bright, brighter than most modern eyes have ever seen them, undimmed by light pollution, unmarred by atmospheric haze. They fill the entire sky, a ceiling of a light, countless points of brilliance stretching from horizon to horizon. The Milky Way is visible as a pale river flowing across the heavens, and you can see it with your naked eye, no telescope required. The darkness is not complete, but rather it's filled with the gentle illumination of starlight, enough to see the shapes of things around you without being harsh or glaring. The pillars rise up around you, their surfaces smooth under your fingers where you reach out to touch one. The stone is cool, substantial, real. There's comfort in that solidity, in the weight of the stone, in knowing that it will endure long after you're gone. You can feel the craftsmanship in how carefully it's been shaped and positioned. Someone spent hours, perhaps days, carving the reliefs into the surface. Someone moved this massive object from the quarry to this spot, a feat of coordination and strength and determination. All of that human effort is present in the stone, preserved in its very shape. There's a fire nearby, and you can feel its warmth on one side of your body. The smoke rises up toward the stars, carrying the scent of wood smoke into the cool night air. Around the fire, other people sit or stand. Maybe 30 people, maybe fewer, maybe more. You can see their shapes silhouetted against the light. You can hear the murmur of their voices, the occasional laugh, the sound of movement and life. The air is cool, not cold, but with that crisp quality that night air has in places far from modern heating and climate control. You can smell the earth, the stone, the smoke, the scent of the people around you. Your own breathing is calm and steady. Your body is relaxed. There's no urgency here, no pressure, just this moment, this place, this gathering of people around a fire beneath the stars, surrounded by the monuments they've built. And you understand, standing here in your imagination, why they built this place. It's because being here matters. It's because reaching towards something greater than yourself matters. It's because the human impulse to create and to gather and to celebrate something sacred is old, so very old, and so very essential to who we are. The warmth from the fire seems to reach through time to touch you now, in your own moment of rest. The cool stone beneath your imaginary fingers feels real. The starlight seems to reach toward you across the 12,000 years that separate you from that ancient hilltop. And in this moment, just before sleep claims you fully, you can sense the connection between you and those ancient people, the connection between their spiritual longing and your own, the shared humanity that bridges the vast gulf of time. They were here, standing exactly where you're standing now in your mind. They felt the warmth of the fire and the coolness of the night air. They looked up at the stars, those same stars that are still there, still burning with the light that began its journey toward Earth thousands of years ago. They were moved to create. They were moved to build. They were moved to reach toward meaning and transcendence, and that same capacity lives in you. That same impulse is in your blood. You are descended from people who built monuments to the sacred. You are part of a story that stretches back 12,000 years, a story of human creativity and human longing and human determination to create meaning in the face of existence. And as that knowledge settles into your mind, as the fire grows warmer and the stars grow brighter, and as your body grows heavier and more comfortable, you can let yourself drift. You can let the peace of this place, this moment, this connection to something ancient and eternal, carry you down into sleep. The monuments stand eternal, and so do the questions they ask about who we are and what we're capable of. Tomorrow those questions will still be there, waiting. But for tonight, let yourself rest. Let yourself dream. Let yourself be held by the knowledge that human beings have always been capable of reaching toward transcendence, and that you carry that same capacity within you, just as those ancient builders at Göbekli Tepe did beneath that starlit sky 12,000 years ago. Thank you for spending your evening with the Calm Archive. If this story about Göbekli Tepe has helped you relax and unwind tonight, I'd truly appreciate if you subscribed so you never miss a new episode. I upload regularly, and there's always something new waiting for you. Another ancient mystery, another voice in the darkness, another story to drift away with. And please, tell me in the comments, what ancient mystery fascinates you the most? What question about the deep past keeps you wondering? I read every comment, and your words become part of our story here. Now, let's settle into the quiet conclusion of our journey to that remarkable hilltop in Turkey. Imagine, if you will, standing on Göbekli Tepe today, in the gentle present moment. The excavations are carefully protected, not hidden, but cared for, beneath modern shelters that rise up from the hillside like a kind of cathedral to knowledge itself. These protective structures are made of simple materials, metal and cloth, designed to shield the ancient stone from the elements, while still allowing researchers and the occasional visitor to witness what was buried for so long. The light filters through these shelters in a soft, diffused way, creating a kind of twilight over the excavation pits, and it is in this gentle half-light that the pillars stand, as they have for 12,000 years, patient and quiet. To walk into one of these shelters, to see the stone enclosures emerge from the earth, to understand that human hands placed these massive carved pillars into the ground 11,000 years before any pyramid was built, it is a moment that changes you. It is a moment of profound humility and profound connection, and in this quiet light you understand something essential about who you are. The surrounding landscape is equally remarkable in its stillness and its simplicity. Göbekli Tepe sits on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, in the region known as the Fertile Crescent, and the view from the top extends across what is called the Harran Plain. This is a landscape of wheat fields and scattered villages, of ancient cultivation and ongoing human habitation, a place where people have lived, worked, built, and dreamed for countless generations. The Turkish countryside rolls out beneath you in waves of gentle colour, golden where the wheat grows, green where the land is still fertile, and in the distance the horizon stretches flat and peaceful, a view that people saw from this exact spot when the world was young. There is something deeply calming about this landscape, something that makes time feel less like a line and more like a circle, because the people who built Göbekli Tepe saw this same horizon, walked this same ground, and felt the same pull to create something lasting, something beautiful, something that would outlive them. The pilgrimage to Göbekli Tepe is a quiet one. There are not crowds here, not like at the pyramids or the great temples of Greece or Rome. The visitors who come are typically scholars, archaeologists, or people who have read about this place and felt called to witness it with their own eyes and their own hearts. When you arrive at the hilltop, you're often alone or with just a handful of others, and this solitude is part of the gift of the place. You can stand at the edge of the excavations, look down at the pillars, and truly hear the silence. You can feel the wind that moves across the plain, the same wind that moved across this hilltop 11,000 years ago. You can close your eyes and listen, and for a moment, just a moment, the distance between your heart and the hearts of the people who built this place seems to shrink. You're standing where they stood. You're looking at the stones they carved. You're breathing the same air, seeing the same sky. What an extraordinary thing to know. To touch one of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe is to touch time itself. The limestone is smooth in some places, worn by human hands and by weather, and rough in others, where the carving still holds its original texture. Some of the pillars are inscribed with animals, the fox with its sly expression, the lion in profile, the vulture with wings spread, and as your fingers trace these ancient carvings, you become aware that this touch connects you directly to the person who held a stone tool and created these marks. Not a drawing, not a painting, but a carving in a stone, a permanent mark, a declaration of meaning. The hunter-gatherers who built this place wanted to create something that would endure, something that would speak across the millennia to whoever came after them, and it did. And you are here, in that future they could never have imagined, and you are moved. You are deeply, quietly moved. When you stand on the hilltop at Göbekli Tepe, you come to understand something profound about the people who built it. These were not primitive people, despite what that word might suggest. They were fully human. Their brains were identical to yours. The woman who carved the fox had the same capacity for love, for creativity, for wonder that you have. The man who positioned the massive limestone pillars had the same problem-solving ability, the same intelligence, the same potential for greatness that any architect or engineer alive today possesses. These people had hopes and fears. They had families and communities. They fell in love. They grieved. They looked at the stars and felt something stir in their hearts that they could not name. They wondered about death, about the meaning of life, about what comes after we close our eyes for the last time. They were asking the same eternal questions that you are asking in the quiet of this late hour as you listen to this voice in the darkness. The realization that Göbekli Tepe's builders were just like us is both humbling and profoundly beautiful. We often think of the past as a foreign country, a place populated by people who were fundamentally different from us, less capable, less sophisticated, less truly human. But this is not true. The same consciousness that you experience right now, the awareness of being alive, the ability to imagine, to create, to feel meaning in things, this same consciousness filled those people. They loved their children the way you love yours. They worked together and argued and laughed together and created something that mattered to them. And we, living thousands of years later, can still feel the weight of their creation, can still be moved by their vision and their effort. What Göbekli Tepe teaches us about human nature is something we might otherwise miss in our modern lives. We are builders. This is not something we learned when we started farming or when we built cities. We were builders even when we were still hunting and gathering our food. We are dreamers. We are believers, even at our most primitive, a word that becomes increasingly meaningless the more we understand our own history. We were capable of extraordinary things. We were capable of envisioning something that did not yet exist, and then bringing it into being through persistence and ingenuity and faith. We were capable of creating beauty when survival was uncertain. We were capable of building temples, of establishing rituals, of gathering together in sacred spaces. This is what humans do. This is who we have always been. The people who built Göbekli Tepe did not have to build it. They were surviving on hunting and gathering. They had no agriculture to support the labour involved. Yet they chose to build. They chose to work together on a massive collaborative project. They chose to create beauty, to carve stone, to build enclosures for gathering and ceremony. They were motivated by something deeper than survival. They were motivated by meaning. And this impulse to create meaning, to build something lasting, to connect with others in sacred space, this is fundamentally human. It is not something that emerged later with civilization. It is something that has always been part of us. Consider the technology and engineering knowledge that Göbekli Tepe required. These limestone pillars, some weighing several tons, were shaped and positioned with precision. There was no metal to work with, no machinery, no wheels. Yet these people managed to quarry the stone, shape it, transport it, and position it with remarkable accuracy. How many people did it take to move a multi-ton pillar? How long did each one take to carve? What system of knowledge allowed them to understand how to do this? These questions point to a sophisticated understanding of engineering, of cooperation, of planning and foresight. We tend to think these are modern skills, but they are ancient. They are human. And here is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Göbekli Tepe. Nearly 95% of the site is still underground. Most of what was built there remains buried and undiscovered. Imagine the pillars that no one has ever seen. Imagine the carvings that have been hidden in darkness for 10,000 years. Imagine the structures and enclosures that wait beneath the earth, still in the exact position where they were left, still holding the secrets of their makers. Somewhere in that soil are stories we have not yet read. Somewhere are carvings of animals we cannot yet name. Somewhere are the marks of human hands that reached out across the millennia, unknowingly toward us. What will we discover when archaeologists finally excavate the rest of the site? What new insights into human creativity, human organization, human spirituality will emerge from that earth? Perhaps there are pillars even larger than those we have found. Perhaps there are inscriptions that will teach us about the mythology and beliefs of these ancient people. Perhaps there are communal spaces that will show us how they gathered and what rituals they performed. Perhaps there are tools and artifacts that will tell us more about how they lived. The 95% that remains underground represents not a loss but a promise. It is a reminder that our knowledge of the past is incomplete, that there are always more mysteries to solve, more stories waiting to be discovered. This concept is deeply comforting in a way. It means that the past is not finished telling us its stories. It means that there is always more to learn, always new wonders waiting to be uncovered. It means that the human story is far more complex and far more ancient than most of us were taught in school. We are living in a time of extraordinary archaeological discovery, and Göbekli Tepe is just the beginning. Somewhere else on this planet, there are other Göbekli Tepes waiting to be found. Other ancient sites that will reshape our understanding of what humans have always been capable of. And this brings us to a profound philosophical reflection about what Göbekli Tepe teaches us about the nature of civilization itself. We often think that civilization begins with agriculture, with the domestication of plants and animals, with the establishment of permanent settlements and the development of cities. We mark this moment as a turning point in human history, the Neolithic Revolution, and we think of everything before it as prehistoric, as somehow less real, less important, less truly civilized. But Göbekli Tepe suggests something different. It suggests that civilization does not begin with agriculture. It begins with meaning. It begins with the moment when someone looks at the stars and feels something stirring inside them. Wonder, awe, the awareness of something greater than themselves. Civilization begins with the moment when someone picks up a stone and decides to make something beautiful, not because it is necessary for survival, but because the act of creating beauty is itself essential to being human. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe are monuments to this impulse. They are monuments to human meaning-making, to the eternal human need to create, to gather together, to establish sacred spaces, to communicate across time with those who came before and those who would come after. Long before we cultivated our first crops, long before we built our first cities, we were doing this. We were gathering in sacred spaces, we were creating ritual, we were marking important transitions and moments in communal life. We were making art. This is what makes us human, not our tools, though we have always been toolmakers, not our agriculture, though we learned to farm, but our capacity for meaning, our drive to create beauty, our need to gather together and acknowledge something larger than ourselves. This is the birth of civilization. And it happened on a hilltop in Turkey 12,000 years ago. Think of Savak the shepherd, walking his flock across that same hilltop years ago, noticing a stone that didn't belong there, a T-shaped limestone pillar emerging from the earth. That single moment of curiosity, that glance downward, that decision to wonder about something unusual, set in motion a chain of events that connected the modern world to 12,000 years of human dreaming and building. One shepherd, one moment of attention, one decision to investigate something that seemed odd. From that tiny spark of curiosity emerged a rediscovery that would reshape our understanding of human history. And how many other moments like that are happening right now? How many people are walking over unexcavated sites, noticing stones and signs of ancient human presence? How many future discoveries are waiting for that moment of attention, that decision to look more carefully at the world beneath our feet? This is true in a metaphorical sense as well. In each of us, there are undiscovered places, areas of ourselves we have not yet explored, depths we have not yet sounded. And just as Göbekli Tepe was waiting for that shepherd's attention, these inner landscapes are waiting for our curiosity, our willingness to look beneath the surface of ourselves. As you lie here, listening to this story, allow your own layers to become visible to you. Allow yourself to notice what lies beneath the surface of your everyday awareness. What is buried in you? What is waiting to be discovered? Now imagine the hilltop at night. The excavations are closed, the shelters are empty, and Göbekli Tepe rests in darkness. The limestone pillars stand in the moonlight, or in the starlight on clear nights when the moon is not visible. These stones, which have stood through 12,000 years, continue their vigil. Nothing disturbs them. The wind moves across the plain and whispers over the hilltop, the same wind that moved across this place when the pillars were newly carved. The night is deep and quiet. The silence is profound. And if you could stand there in that darkness, if you could feel the presence of those stones around you, you would understand something about the continuity of human existence. You would feel the connection between yourself and all those who came before, all those who looked at the stars and wondered, all those who created meaning in the face of an uncertain universe. The stars above Göbekli Tepe are the same stars that wheeled overhead 12,000 years ago. The constellations have not changed. The slow procession of the equinoxes is happening so gradually that it would take many thousands more years to alter the night sky noticeably. So when the people who built Göbekli Tepe looked up from their work, when they rested during the day and looked toward the evening, when they gathered in the temple enclosures at night and looked upward, they saw the same stars you see. They saw Orion and the Big Dipper and the Milky Way stretching across the sky. They wondered about those lights in the darkness just as you do. They created stories about them, just as humans have always done. And now, 12,000 years later, those stars continue their eternal turning, and the human impulse to wonder and to make meaning continues as well. As you rest now, let the weight of this knowledge settle over you like a blanket. You are part of an unbroken chain of human experience. The same consciousness that animated the people who built Göbekli Tepe animates you. The same need for beauty, for meaning, for connection. These drive you as they drove them. You're not separate from the past. You are continuous with it. You are its future manifestation. The person who carved the fox 12,000 years ago did not know your name, could not have imagined your world, yet in building that temple, in creating that carving, in gathering with others in sacred space, they were reaching toward the future. They were building something that would endure, something that would speak across the millennia. And you are receiving that message. You are the one they were building for, in a way. You are part of the story they started. This thought can be deeply comforting. It means you are not alone. It means you are part of something vast and ancient and ongoing. It means your own small acts of creation, your own moments of wonder, your own decisions to build beauty into your life. These are not insignificant. They are part of the same human impulse that built Göbekli Tepe. You're continuing a 12,000-year-old conversation with the past. You're adding your own voice to a chorus that stretches back into the depths of human history. Let this settle into your mind as you begin to rest. Let the image of Göbekli Tepe and the starlight become your companion as you drift towards sleep. The hilltop is quiet. The stones are standing. The stars are turning. The wind is gentle. And you, like countless humans before you, are surrendering to the need for rest, for darkness, for the renewal that comes with sleep. This is as old as Göbekli Tepe. This is as human as the impulse to build. Rest has always been sacred. Sleep has always been a refuge. In the silence of the night, in the darkness that surrounds you now, there is comfort. There is the warmth of your own bed, the softness of your pillow, the weight of blankets that keep you safe and warm. There is the rhythm of your own breathing, steady and even, carrying you deeper into relaxation with each slow exhale. There is the knowledge that you have spent this evening connected to something ancient and beautiful, something that speaks to the very deepest part of what it means to be human. You have stood, at least in imagination, on the hilltop where people gathered 12,000 years ago. You have seen the stones they carved. You have felt the continuity of human experience. And now you are safe. Now you are warm. Now you are part of the long sleep that humans have taken since the first moment we closed our eyes in rest. Rest now, knowing that you are safe. Rest knowing that you are part of a story far older and far grander than any single lifetime. Rest knowing that the people who built Göbekli Tepe reached forward through the ages and touched your heart tonight. Rest knowing that you are continuing their work, in your own way, by creating meaning and beauty in your own life. Rest in the knowledge that your dreams tonight, like the dreams of all humans before you, are a sacred gift. A time when your mind can wander through landscapes both ancient and new, visiting places of wonder and peace. The night is settling now, deeper and more complete. The world outside is quiet. The people you love are safe in their own rest. You're held in the darkness, in the silence, in the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. There is nothing you need to do right now. There is nowhere you need to go. There is only this moment and this darkness and the extraordinary comfort of being able to close your eyes and surrender to sleep. This is your time. This is your rest. This is your sacred space, just as Göbekli Tepe was sacred space for the people who gathered there so long ago. So close your eyes now, if you haven't already. Let them stay closed. Feel the weight of your body sinking into your bed, becoming heavier and more relaxed with each breath. Feel the tension in your shoulders and your neck and your jaw slowly releasing, melting away like ice in warmth. Feel your mind becoming quieter, your thoughts becoming gentler, your awareness drifting from the outer world into the inner landscape of sleep. You are safe here. You are warm here. You are home. The story of Göbekli Tepe, the story of human creativity and meaning-making, and the eternal human impulse to build and to dream. This story will be waiting for you whenever you want to hear it again. But for now, let it recede like the tide going out, leaving you with just the feeling of peace it created. Let the image of that hilltop fade into the background of your consciousness. Let your breath become the only sound you need to hear. Let your own heartbeat become the only rhythm that matters. Sleep now, knowing you have been part of something beautiful tonight. Sleep knowing that you are part of the long human story. Sleep in the warmth and darkness and absolute safety of this moment. Sleep like the earth sleeps around Göbekli Tepe, dark and deep and full of ancient dreams. Sleep like all humans have slept, since the first nights of our species, surrendering to the night with trust and faith. This is the end of our journey together tonight. But it is also a beginning, the beginning of your rest, the beginning of whatever dreams your mind will create in the darkness. May they be gentle, may they be peaceful. May you wake refreshed and renewed, carrying with you the memory of this story and the knowledge of your connection to the ancient world. Good night. Rest well. You are home.